If you go on TikTok and follow the science-based guys there, you're gonna hear that like low volume training is the truly science-based training. It's more along the lines of what like Dorian Yates did, what Mike Menser did. Men basically just like start out with more muscle than women, but they gain the same amount of muscle relative to their starting lean mass. As you get closer to failure, you're getting more gains, okay? That's pretty clear.
Yep.
Is there a take you've heard me have that you've disagreed with?
Yeah, sure. You have 10 weeks for us to increase the thickness of your biceps as much as possible. How would you train?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm here with two of, I think, the biggest researchers in the fitness and bodybuilding space right now. If you guys have watched any of my videos, you have heard me talk about two papers in particular. I think these two papers probably had a bigger impact on the space than maybe any other papers that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years at least, right? Okay, so there are two papers here. You're the lead author on one. So this is Zac Robinson, and this is Josh Pelland. You have your PhD completed. Yep. You're in the process of finishing yours, is that right?
Close.
Yeah, you're almost done?
Almost done.
Okay. And so you're the lead author on the paper that investigated the impact of training to failure on hypertrophy and strength. And basically found that like the harder you train, the more gains you get.
That's
right?
A simplified version, sure. Yep.
And you're the lead author on the paper that basically showed the relationship between training volume, so the number of sets you do, and your gains, which basically found the more volume you do,
more is better.
The more gains you make, right? So like if I was to take both of these
train as hard
papers,
as you can, as much as you can, baby.
That's it, right? Okay, so I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think there is more to it than that.
Absolutely.
But I think if you were to take these papers at face value, you would kind of walk away with the message that to make the best gains possible, you should do as much as possible, as hard as possible.
Yep.
Right?
It's a surface level, but it's more than just a surface level.
Okay, so I want to start with training to failure. So I'll just say, okay, training to failure is basically when you go until you can't get another rep, right? So you actually just like fail.
Sure.
Do you think training to failure is overrated for muscle growth?
Underrated. Currently.
Underrated. Okay.
Because of, so the reason I would say that is more so from the practical side of things, I would say. The thing that everyone would agree on is that being close to failure is important. So purely from a practical perspective, and I would be curious if you guys echo this from your experience. I think it's easy to say that once you kind of know what failure feels like or experience it, you kind of know. But that personally, in my experience, particularly with certain exercises, muscle groups, et cetera, you kind of need to remind yourself pretty frequently. And so hitting failure relatively regularly, I think ensures your training is of a high quality, gives you those touch points relatively frequently. And I think there's a ton of downstream benefits that happen from that. Of a lot of those reasons, I think underrated.
No, that's fair. Do you agree with him, Josh?
I would say on average, yes, underrated. I would really underscore the point that it kind of depends on the perspective you're coming from. If you go to your typical Globo gym, definitely underrated, right? Yeah. Most people are going to benefit from training harder, training closer to failure, potentially even failure on every single set or close to it. Now, at the same time, if you look at some of the findings from the paper we're talking about here, it's not like you go from 4 RER to 3 RER to 2 RER to 1 RER to failure, and you just see this exponential increase in hypertrophy such that, 4 RER is not muscle growth promoting at all, right? So you can absolutely still grow muscle further from failure. So it's an option on the table, but I think that training to or close to failure based on the data we do have seems to be a good default. Yeah. And the way that I see it is, unless you have a good reason not to train to failure, you probably should most of the time. So reasons to not train to failure might be like safety. If there's, you're leg pressing and there's no safety mechanism to fail, that's an obvious reason to maybe, leave a rep in the tank. But in the absence of those sorts of things, man, I think it's a really, really good default.
I think two other things I'd note that I think are often not considered is one, I don't want to say never because absolutes are tough, but I've rarely seen studies where training, on the harder side of the equation, whatever the comparison is worse. And then also like in terms of the scientific aspect of things, when you say, well, this study isn't showing a difference between 3 RER and failure or what have you, there's a whole conversation there on the types of study design, sample sizes, things that would be necessary to detect the difference you would actually expect there. So like that's something I don't think is often thought about. So take the volume comparison, for example. Let's say we go from 10 to 20 sets. That's literally doubling the amount of training that you're doing. As far as things go in terms of comparing two different types of programs, that's probably one of the biggest effects we would possibly see. The difference between training at 0 RER or to failure versus like 1, 2, or 3 RER is going to be so infinitesimally smaller than that. And to be able to detect that in an individual study, you're looking at over 100 people, even like within subjects design. So,
well, I think this is. I'll play devil's advocate,
Sure.
I guess, even though I think this is probably my opinion.
Sure.
I tend to say overrated because I think what a lot of people believe is something
Magical.
special happens at that point of failure.
100%.
So once you hit that point of failure, now you've activated all the highest threshold muscle fibers. You're going to see way more growth.
Absolutely.
Whereas if you stop 1 rep shy, it's like,
useless.
dude, you were so close. Like what happened? Like you're leaving gains on the table there. And I think that principle is super overrated.
For sure.
Because, so again, it's uncontroversial that training hard is incredibly important to maximize muscle hypertrophy.
Absolutely.
I will say, I still think in certain contexts, training hard is even overrated because you can reap all kinds of benefits like strength, mental health benefits, longevity benefits, muscle health benefits, yada, 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 even if you don't even train that hard, honestly. Like you still benefit from resistance training, right? So it's like, okay, training hard, that's super, super important. Okay, yada, yada. In the context of people who are trying to optimize muscle growth, right? So like even that it has some gray areas, okay? But I would just say, in the context of comparing it to a sufficiently hard set or a set that's like 2, 3, 1 reps in reserve, I think training to failure is kind of overrated because if it were, this is an argument, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've made the argument that like if it were the case that training to failure, where you have no reps in the tank, is truly the best way to train, you would not or incredibly rarely see studies that flip the other way, where you actually see better gains with reps in reserve, which you have observed, right? There are studies that see better gains when you leave reps in the tank, right?
I think it depends on what you mean by better gains. I think that's where the concept of actually detecting differences is really, really important. So the easiest way to kind of think about it is, let's say there's some known difference between the two. And let's just, for this example, let's say it is in favor of failure just marginally. The sample size of the studies, the designs of those studies, the overall context of the programs is basically going to determine the kind of normal distribution around that line that you're going to see on either side. And purely based on the idea of there being, type 1 errors, false positives, if the difference that we expect between the two interventions is extremely, extremely small, which in my opinion it is. If you think about the context of a relatively high volume intervention with good exercises, and the difference we're talking about is 1 or 2 reps per exercise, the difference between those two interventions is so small. And if we compare that to like the difference we would expect from like a program of 10 versus 20 sets, which when you look at the metas that we have, that difference is already really, really small. So the studies that you're going to see on both sides of that kind of expected line, some of them are probably going to fall in line of 2 to 3 reps in reserve or whatever, or in some of them are going to be in favor of failure, even though the aspect of the actual difference that if we knew it from above the clouds that we can't really see is a very, very small difference. And so to me, the kind of the literature that we do have tends to support that as far as my view is, for the most part, you're going to not see any differences. So we know the effect is probably going to be really, really small. You'll see occasionally a study here, a study there, but for historically most of the meta-analyses that have been done, in addition to the one that we're talking about, typically the effect size is going to be marginally in favor of the closer to failure condition, not by a lot. But I think that's kind of what you would expect if the differences are really, really small. So in general, that's kind of where I'm at with it. But I totally see your opinion. And I think you can definitely make contexts where certain approaches can be better or worse. So easy example, one of the things we looked at in this meta-analysis was what was the impact of the percentage of 1RM that you're training at on the relationship with proximity to failure. Now, I'll withhold from going in a whole conversation about subgroup analyses and meta-analysis and the limitations thereof. Take it with a grain of salt, but in general, the heavier that you're training, probably tends to equalize that relationship between training closer to failure and farther from failure. And that conceptually makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If you're starting a repetition or starting a set with one rep that's inherently closer to failure because you're lifting a 6 rep max instead of a 15 rep max, you probably don't need to necessarily go as close to failure with those types of loads. So I think there are contexts which you can manipulate to make that very, very small conceptual difference that we might expect kind of equalize out in certain scenarios. So to me, even that point that you kind of mentioned of some studies maybe directionally favoring reps in reserve, I think kind of makes sense if we expect the difference to be really small in general.
So again, it's not to say that like, oh, look, there's a couple studies that show that training less hard is actually better. It's more so to say that like you said, if there really was a big difference of going to failure, you would see that showing up more consistently and in greater magnitude across the body of research,
100%.
right? Which you don't. For example, if not even the volume example, let's just say like steroids versus no steroids.
There you go.
Like you're never going to see a study that flips the other way because the difference is too big.
large.
You're always going to see more gains with steroids.
Exactly.
I think a lot of people in the fitness industry think of failure in a similar way.
Sure.
They're like, if you're not going to failure, you're not
Wasting your
maximizing
time.
your gains, right? Or you're wasting your time. It's like this difference is big, and it's like no. Like even the study that showed that the best research you can point to make the case for training to failure, which I do think is your guys' paper.
Thank you.
The difference between 1 RIR, 2 RIR, and 0 RIR is pretty small.
It's
right?
not night and day. And I like to remind myself and remind folks that progressive resistance training works.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
Especially in the populations typically studied. And any differences regarding these variables is going to be relatively small compared to whether or not training occurred.
Right.
So we're talking about relatively small things. Now, add that up over a training career for an advanced lifter where the difference is, no gains over the next year versus a little bit of gains over the next year. Now these things might start to matter, but again, in terms of the context of resistance training studies, we're talking about like very small differences.
Okay, I'm going to actually pull this graph up. So audio listeners, I will explain what I'm looking at. I want people to understand that, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Like, look at all these dots. Okay, I feel like everybody just looks at the line.
Sure.
But like,
You're speaking his language.
Explain to me what each of these dots represents.
Sure. So essentially, when you go through the process of doing a meta-analysis, we're going to collect all of the studies that are going to fall within our inclusion criteria for our research question. So in this case, we went through the body of evidence, and it was a wider inclusion criteria, which I think is one of the reasons it kind of helped us detect some of these really, really small differences compared to some of the previous meta-analyses. And that's one of the advantages, but also maybe a limitation in some eyes. But the point is, we get all those studies, and we go through and we calculate the difference that is achieved pre and post training. And then we go through and then we ultimately standardize those units because some studies are going to use centimeters squared. Some studies are going to use millimeters and use different types of measurements, cross-sectional area, muscle thickness, those kind of things. So you go through the process of calculating these pre to post differences in training. You standardize those units so they all kind of are on the same scale. And then ultimately, when you plot those, you're looking at what's the relationship between proximity to failure, the repetitions in reserve they trained with on average, and the amount of muscle size that they saw in terms of the training improvements on a standardized scale. So that's kind of the axes you're looking at. So when we do that, I think people inherently are like, oh, there's a ton of spread here, which is very true. There's, you have to think about all the different other variables that are different between training programs. There you have different exercises, different rest intervals, different amount of volume, different lengths of the training intervention. So that's all going to contribute to the amount of variability that you're seeing on the y-axis there. But the thing that we're ultimately trying to do with projects like this is what is the relationship that is explained by this one variable that was manipulated in these studies, which is the proximity to failure. So accounting for all these, clusterings of the different effect sizes that come from different studies, what's that relationship between this one predictor that we care about? And that's ultimately what you see on that graph is that ultimately that relationship.
Are each one of these dots a different study?
It's a different effect. So sometimes studies will have multiple effect sizes. So let's say they reported 3 different quadriceps muscle thicknesses, 30, 50, 70%. All of those would be represented on that plot.
So what we're looking at here is basically on the x-axis, so along the bottom, we've got proximity to failure. Okay. So as you get closer to 0, you're getting closer to failure. And then as you go up the y-axis, you're getting more gains, basically,
exactly.
right? And so when you look at this line, you can see that as you get closer to failure, you're getting more gains. Okay. That's pretty clear. But here's the thing though, like each one of those dots is a different, like, I don't know, 10 to 40 people, right? Training, okay? These are not individual subjects. These are individual studies.
Correct.
It's kind of a cluster. Like it's kind of like if you were to take that line away and just tell me to look at that and be like, what's the relationship here? I would be like, not a whole lot. And so here's the thing. Like, I just want to point out some of this for people, okay? This study here, it looks like on average, people were about 6 to 8 reps from failure, they still make gains. People in this study actually made better gains than the people over here at 1 rep. Now I know this is probably driving you crazy because you can't do that statistically, but there's a lot of variability here, you know, and it simply is the case that like almost all of these studies showed gains. Like even this one over here that was like 16 reps shy of failure still had a positive impact on gains, right? So like, what do you make of that? Like, is the effect just like weaker than people think? Because I feel like a lot of people, especially in the science-based niche, took this and were like, bro, what are we doing anymore? Like, take everything to failure. But when I look at this, I'm kind of just like, okay, there's a trend there for sure. But like, bro, a lot of these studies are getting like crazy gains. I mean, like the study that literally showed the best gains here had 6 reps reserved. Okay. So like, I mean, there's a little more gray area here than I think people realize.
Tons of good points. Okay. So let me try to remember most of them. So the first thing I'd say is that I 100% want to underline this with this project. One of the biggest limitations is in this area of research, you have very few studies that actually report the reps in reserve that people train at. That was kind of one bucket of our inclusion criteria, but the vast majority of studies, we had to go through a procedure of admittedly subjective. But what I tried to do when we went through this estimation process was make every single one of these decisions extremely explicit, as consistent as humanly possible, and all of that is openly available to see how it was done. So essentially, we had a couple different buckets of studies. All of them use slightly different estimation criteria to try to get the best estimation of the average proximity to failure utilized. And that's what's on the x-axis there. So it's an important distinction between estimated proximity to failure. So if you look at the title, that's the first word, versus the true known proximity to failure. So that, of course, alone from everything else that we'll talk about is something to keep in mind. Now, I wouldn't have went through the process of doing that if I didn't think it was still helpful. But I do think that is very important to keep in mind. So when we communicate this project, the way that I like to think about what is the main thing that we're getting out of this is directionally, what are we looking at? It's not what is the exact effect size of 0 reps in reserve, 1 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, because we can't really know that. We can't verify that that was actually 1 rep in reserve. But what I have more confidence in, because all the estimations were performed in a relatively consistent manner, is directionally we're probably going to find the right pattern. But the exact reps in reserve, that might be a little bit foggy. So that's the first thing I'd say. The next thing I'd say, and this is a great point because I think this is extremely, extremely common when people kind of look at these plots, is the thing that is not intuitive when you look at something like this is that obviously in the equation of training variables, proximity to failure is an important variable, but it's not the only thing that matters. So every single study in that plot is going to have different exercise selection, different lengths of the training intervention, different supervision levels, and all exercise selection, if I already said that one, resistance profiles, all the things that you talk about on your channel that form this cornucopia of training variables that ultimately influence the expected outcome that we actually see. Training proximity to failure is important, but it's only one of these possible things. So when we look at the variability there, that's the first thing you should think about. And then when we actually go to perform the meta-analysis, what's actually happening is you're looking at the within study comparisons between these different proximities to failure. So what would probably be better to look at is the slopes of the individual studies. So what is with the same exercise selection, same rest intervals, same intervention duration, what's the difference there? And then we're essentially combining those to form this overall dose-response relationship. So I think that when you purely look at it this way, I think the variability is maybe a little bit overstated in the sense that that's not necessarily the variability that matters. The variability that matters is the variability in that slope of RAR across the different studies when everything else is held the same. And that's essentially what we're meta-analyzing, as opposed to those individual data points, because all that's communicating is, hey, proximity to failure isn't the only thing that predicts training response.
That's fair.
Right? So I think that is the main thing. And of course, I understand what you're saying is like people look at this and be like, man, this is just fitting lines with dots. And that was a lot of the stuff we got when we've done these projects. But it is a little bit more involved in that to handle all of the things that are kind of going on under the hood to create that best estimate of what we think the actual relationship is. And sometimes the dots can be a little bit misleading to see exactly what is being modeled there, if that makes sense.
And just to use that example of that highest effect being at a relatively high RAR, so relatively far from failure, that effect, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but that could be from a study that was 30 weeks long.
Yeah.
Whereas one of these
Way better
effects,
exercises,
one of these
higher
effects
volumes.
at failure
Exactly.
could be from an 8-week study. So in a lot of ways, what Zac is saying is like, it's not like you just take, okay, this group at this measurement site in San Antonio, Texas, trained at this RAR and saw this growth. We're just going to chuck that data point in the plot. And then we're going to take one from some other place and do the same process and then just create a best fit line. Instead, what you're doing is you're saying, no, at this lab, they compared 3 versus 5 RAR on average. And what is the difference between those two? That's what's being analyzed, that difference within a study. So that accounts for all of the variability across all those different labs, all those different studies around the world. And in a lot of ways, we went back and forth on this during the process of doing these projects, is like, those data points are pretty...
They're misleading and they're not.
They can be misleading.
Yeah.
All right. That's fantastic. On a gut level, I want to get both of you guys' opinion on the difference, okay, in gains. All right, and don't think about this too hard. All right, the difference in gains as a percentage.
Sure.
2 reps in reserve versus 0 reps in reserve. So 2 reps left in the tank versus failure, and we're looking at 12 weeks.
2.5%.
Okay.
In reality, but I think our ability to measure that in any realistic scenario is going to be super small.
Okay. What do you think?
So it would be like, in your case, 10% versus 12.5%. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I'd say 1 to 2.5%, something pretty.
Yeah, I think we're looking at, probably, I'd say around 2% or so.
All right. And then what are we looking at?
Which is hard to measure.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why
Any
we're not
individual
seeing
study
a
is,
huge effect.
yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then, see, I mean, honestly, that, yeah, that feels small, but for people looking to optimize, I could see how that would be worth it. Now,
Sure.
I don't think the reason you want to train to failure is to get that 2.5%, which maybe it is, but not for everybody. I think the reason you want to train to failure is what you alluded to earlier, which is it reminds you of what hard training actually feels like, and it helps standardize that for you, right? So if you're always leaving 2-3 reps in reserve, it's perfectly plausible that you are in fact leaving 5, 6, 7 reps in reserve regularly and not really realizing it. So yeah, you update that. Another gut level question, and then we'll move on to volume.
Sure.
All right, 2.5. Okay, not bad. What about I'm leaving 10 reps in reserve versus going to failure? But that doesn't even make sense if I'm doing a set of 10, right? Because then a set of 10 reps would be 0 reps versus 10 reps. So,
conceptually,
let's say we're doing a set of 20 reps, okay? And I'm taking one to failure, and I hit failure at 20. On the other one, I stop at 10.
Yeah.
All right. What's the difference in gains there?
Trained individuals?
Is there a big difference between trained and untrained individuals? I mean,
I would say yes, just because the stimulus of training at all is probably going to be
pretty big for newbies.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with newbies.
Newbies, assuming they see 12%, 15% growth in 12 weeks, I'd say they probably would get maybe half that training. 10 reps in reserve, something like that.
So you're looking at about half the gains if you leave 10 reps in the tank.
Yeah.
Okay.
Particularly in this scenario.
But you're saying taking someone off the street and
this is a completely new lifter.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. Okay. Now to me that's interesting, because I actually do think more people than most realize do probably train with 10 RIR. Like if you just walk into any random LA Fitness, like you see people just pumping and then dropping the weights and like there's no control. There's 0 rep slow down, which is an indication of how close you are to failure. So like in that instance, like absolutely leaving gains on the table by not training hard enough. Right?
Absolutely. And keep in mind that if you take untrained folks and you have them
do cardio
or high intensity interval training,
they'll grow.
They're going to grow. So that's really important to keep in mind. We're definitely not recommending 10 RR by any means. But that, again, progressive resistance training works, especially in untrained or beginner-esque folks.
Okay. Is there a point where like it really starts to take off the closer I get to failure? So for example, like if I leave 5 reps in the tank, am I still leaving a lot of gains on the table? Or now are we roughly probably like, okay, now you're looking at like, because if it's like 50% with 10 reps, if I'm down to 5 reps in the tank, am I looking at like, okay, maybe you're leaving about like 25%? Or is there a certain point where it's like, okay, now these sets are hard. Like now we're activating those bigger, higher threshold muscle fibers, and now you're probably getting the gains. Like, is there actually like kind of an inflection point there, or is it just kind of like steady going up to 0 RIR?
That's a great question. The obvious answer is I don't know. My gut opinion is there's probably some threshold where it accelerates a little bit, and that's probably training status dependent a bit. Would be my guess. And the reason I suspect that is because of the relationship with heavier loads. So if that weren't the case, then there really wouldn't be a loading range that would really impact the proximity to failure relationship. But because heavier loads seem to allow for slightly more submaximal proximities to failure, maybe once you reach a certain percentage of 1RM or a certain rep max, kind of everything's productive. And so that kind of suggests there's kind of that gated effect where like, oh, it's really productive training now. But I think that's definitely speculative. And I don't think it's a black or white cutoff, to be very clear. I think it's more definitely gradual, but I think there is probably a point where it accelerates a little bit, would be my gut reaction.
Now, when you say heavier loads, you can kind of get away with whatever. Like, would that help support the idea that like it just makes more sense to train in like a 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 rep range for muscle growth?
I think that if someone believes that the fatigue associated with failure is a very, very big deterrent to their overall stimulus of their training program. And that can be mitigated by training with heavier loads and not requiring necessarily as close of proximities of failure. I think that's a reasonable argument to make. Purely from a practical perspective, I think obviously certain exercises don't necessarily lend themselves super well to those lower rep ranges. But in general, I think this is kind of where, powerlifters tend to really shine. And kind of the anecdotes here is that a lot of the SBD work that tends to build muscle, even though it's not on paper the most efficient way to train for hypertrophy, probably, they're not often taking their back off sets of SBD to failure, but it's still relatively productive in building muscle. And so, I think it really just depends on the downsides that you think are associated with the fatigue of training to failure. And if that is something worth manipulating the other variables in your program to try to have to avoid. That's essentially the way that I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. That's super interesting. Okay. I swear when I like thought how this was going to go down, I kind of expected a like rapid fire, like overrated, because it started with like, is it overrated or underrated? Sure. I did not expect to get that into the weeds, but like, hopefully it was interesting for someone other than just me. All right. So this is the failure paper. Zac, you were the lead author on this one. You were the lead author on the volume paper. So I'm going to start with some questions for you about training volume. The first one is, okay, I should set some like guardrails here. All right. I would consider training volume to kind of break down like this. So for anybody who doesn't know, we're just going to count training volume as like the number of hard sets you do for a muscle in a week, basically, right? So like if I do 5 sets for my chest in a week, my training volume for my chest would be 5, right? And that is not including warm-up sets, right? So those are sets that are hard. Yep. And I would say what we count as hard is probably like maybe 2 reps in reserve, something like that, 2 or 3 reps in reserve.
I think that works.
Okay. And obviously, or harder than that. So like if you go to failure, but it doesn't necessarily have to be to failure. Okay. I would consider low volume something in the range of like 5 to maybe 10 sets per muscle per week. Mm-hmm. I would consider moderate volume to be 10 to 15 sets per muscle per week. And then I would consider high volume maybe like more than 20 sets per muscle per week. Like you could say, okay, just to set up the range is better. 10 to 20 is kind of moderate. Above 20 would be high.
Sounds good.
Even though I feel like going over 15 is still kind of high if you really think about it. Like depends on the muscle a little bit. Like doing 15 sets of back feels kind of moderate. Doing 15 sets of chest to me feels like a lot. 15 sets of calves feels like a hell of a lot. You know what I mean? So anyway, those will be like kind of how
5 to 10, 10, 20, 20 plus.
Yeah, let's do that.
Cool.
Okay. So, all right, high volume training. Do you think it's overrated or underrated?
I personally think it's overrated.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you look at the headline findings from that paper, and I think when a lot of people read through it the first time, they see the figure, maybe with varying degrees of context. Basically what you see is this dose-response relationship, right? So on the x-axis, you have the number of sets, just like you outlined, per muscle group per week. On the y-axis, you have gains, right? Basically what you see is this line go up, and it doesn't really seem to stop, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, especially if you've been following evidence-based fitness for a while, there's this inverted U hypothesis, right? And that, I would say, potentially due to this paper, has kind of faded into the background a bit. But I do still think that's kind of like the general thought process people have is like, I'm gonna do more sets, I'm gonna get more gains, but you can definitely do too much and you eventually get kind of worse hypertrophy. It's not like you don't grow muscle, but you kind of see this downward slope of the curve. And that's not what we saw in the data.
Yeah, I know.
So a lot of people, the headline finding is like, oh, more is better, high volume, that's the way to go. The data set goes up to something ridiculous, like 30, 40 plus sets per muscle group per week. Therefore, oh, you're the lead author of that paper, you must think high volume is the way to go. And this is where I kind of take my researcher hat off. I put my practitioner hat on a little bit, and I say, you got to really keep in mind what the goal of the research is and what this is and isn't telling us, what the data can and can't tell us. And practically, just to kind of jump all the way to the end here, and I'll see what threads you want to pull on here. I'll be the first to say that as a lifter myself and as a coach, I very rarely prescribe more than 20 sets per muscle group per week. Do I at times? Do I think there's utility? Of course. But there's a lot of things that lead me to prescribing low and moderate volumes if we use our ranges, as opposed to high volumes as a default.
Okay. I actually think I pretty much fully agree. I'm a little surprised by your answer because I feel like a lot of the people who talk about this study tend to, I would say, present it in more a way that, like, if you're trying to optimize your gains, like, yeah, you should do more. Now, if you don't want to do more, you don't have to. You just got to live with those gains on the table. But I from a practical standpoint, I do agree. Now, more of like, I guess, a social media related question. I don't know how tapped into this side of the fitness world you guys are. I see you guys more as academics, but like, are you aware that, like, depending on what platform you go on, you might hear an entirely different representation of what the science says. So like if you go on TikTok, you are going to hear
I don't have a TikTok account.
No? Okay, so I'll fill you in. So if you go on TikTok and follow the science-based guys there, you're going to hear that like low volume training is the truly science-based training. It's more along the lines of what like Dorian Yates did, what Mike Menser did. You absolutely should go to failure. You should do a low number of sets. So like maybe 5 to 10 sets per muscle per week, maybe even lower. And like that's how you train as an evidence-based person. If you go on YouTube, you might run into people like me, maybe Dr. Mike, probably Milo Wolf, and you're going to hear like, okay, no. Like the science really does show that more volume causes more gains. Now, there are all these like terms and conditions where it's like, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to optimize. And like, there are cases where you might want to do lower volume, et cetera, et cetera. But like, if we're just talking about what is purely science-based, you just simply have to acknowledge that this is what the evidence shows. Like the more sets you do, the more gains you make. And so the way I would frame it up is like, you have one camp of this like science-based community that would basically say like effort/intensity is like really by far the most important thing. And like the way you optimize that is by doing less sets. Okay. So it's low volume, high intensity. All right. This is not a new thing, but like in social media, there's like really this big rift, right? Sure. And then on the other side, it would be, well, actually the volume trend seems to be really strong. Doing more sets is really important. roughly like equivocal when it comes to like 0 RIR versus 2 RIR or whatever. Like you should do more sets and maybe dial back on the intensity a little bit. So you've got this one camp that's like high intensity, lower volume. You've got another camp that's like high volume, lower intensity. Which side of that do you find yourself coming down on more? Like which one do you align with more?
Assuming we're talking about muscle hypertrophy, right?
Hypertrophy. Yeah.
Hypertrophy. Okay. So
you can't put yourself in the middle.
Practically, I would lean a little bit more on the lower volume, high intensity. But again, I'll be very clear. Like I can't give you 10 citations of where they compare, low volume, high intensity and high volume, slightly lower intensity and say, hey, quantitatively, I can say that's absolutely the case. So I'll simultaneously say like practically I lean that way a little bit, but it's not because there is a lack of a dose response as we see it in the data. So yeah, exactly. So I have a couple points here. One thing is keep in mind it's not an either or decision. I think that is probably like, if there's one thing I could have the listener take away from this is like, it's not low volume, high intensity versus high volume, low intensity. I think that it can be yes and. I think if you're really looking to maximize your results, you can do high volume all the way to failure. And we also need to keep in mind what the data can and can't tell us. So let me give you a basic example. Let's say I'm recruiting for a volume study and we're looking to investigate moderate to high. So using our ranges, we're looking to investigate 15 sets per week compared to 30 sets per week. But let's say I take someone at the university and I bring them into the lab and I tell them about the study a little bit, see if they're a good candidate, and I explain what we're doing and the potential groups that they might end up in. And I explain, hey, we're basically going to do 30 sets per muscle group per week, and that's a possibility. You could get randomized to one of those groups, and they dip out of there, right? That's basically a limitation of the research, because in order for someone to be on that dose response graph, they need to have enrolled in the study. They need to have finished the study as well. So if someone dropped out or they didn't even sign up in the first place because it was unfeasible for them, they wouldn't end up in there. So there's basically a selection bias baked into the dose-response relationship. So what the dose-response relationship tells us, in my opinion, is the physiological dose-response relationship between additional volume and gains. It's not the exact outcomes you would expect in practice over a year or 2 years or a whole training career.
Okay, good. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
You agree with all that?
100%. Yeah.
I'll be honest. I'm a little like surprised at your answer. I don't know why. I guess I just like expected you. I expected you to. I actually quite strongly expected you to be the other way. If I'm being honest.
I tend to think, the volume is definitely overrated as well. I think that's the that's the conclusion I would come to as well. Is that based on the whole conceptualization of the entire situation, I think it's generally overrated, because I think the diminishing returns are vastly, vastly underestimated, which we can talk about at length. But yeah, that's where I fall. And then in terms of falling on one of the two sides practically, I would pretty much always lean on the lower volume, higher intensity side for tons of practical reasons that I think the one relevant to this conversation is the underestimation of the dose-response relationship, or the diminishing returns of that dose-response relationship. So yeah, I'd say I'd largely agree with what he has to say from a practical perspective. And again, I think it goes in one ear, out the other from what he's saying about the dose-response relationships here. Tell us about the physiological nature of that relationship. If we can take somebody's muscle out of their body and kind of train it in this state where we are sure they're going to be able to finish the training program, all these sorts of things, that's kind of the selection bias that he's describing. That's a little bit over characterized, but that's kind of the idea. And so in that situation, sure, more seems to be better. And you can kind of, all the studies in this also train to failure for the most part. So that's where he's saying it's also not an either or discussion. It is kind of a train as hard as you can. That seems to lead to better results if you kind of take the two projects together. However, when we layer all these practical things on top of it, that's obviously extremely important when you're kind of going into the gym and setting up your program.
Okay, excellent. I mean, I would agree, honestly, but like that moment for me, I think happened like relatively recently, because I had always been kind of more of a moderate to high volume guy. And I think like, less recently, especially with these new papers, but I think like prior to this, I think like the mainstream scientific like pseudo consensus would have been like, okay, you can maximize gains with a couple reps in reserve, but there seems to be this clear dose response relationship between volume and muscle growth, right? So if you're going to prioritize one, and I should explain, dose response relationship, basically, as you do more volume, you make more gains, right? So like if you're going to lean toward one or the other, you should lean toward the one that's been shown to have a clear positive relationship, right? So it's like basically, okay, do moderate to high volume and leave a couple reps in the tank. And then over time, maybe do a little more volume because that seems to be better, blah, blah, blah. Recently, I've found that like I just seem to do better with lower volume, higher intensity, like basically everything to failure. I had like a fantastic experience with it. And I'm not entirely sure like why that is, but like it's just was true. And like I have some even like some N=1 data to back that up. Like even in a deficit, I added lean mass, now probably within the margin of error, but like nonetheless, if I had lost a lot by literally cutting my volume in half, you probably wouldn't see it like go up, and my strength was going up. Like everything was really good. So like, why do you guys think that might be the case?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If I said, Jeff, we're going to measure using an ultrasound and maybe we have some other tools as well. You have 10 weeks for us to increase the thickness of your biceps as much as possible. How would you train?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know what, man? I would train so I would prioritize effort. So like that would be the main thing I would do. And then I would try to do as many sets as I could without injuring myself or overtraining.
I agree with you. Yeah. The reason I asked that is because you were thinking of that on a short-term time scale, 10 weeks. That's the average in this data set was 10 and a half weeks. I think that's absolutely the right answer. But if I said, Jeff, you need to increase your biceps muscle thickness and your overall body composition as much as possible over the next 10 years, it's probably a different answer.
It would be a different answer, yeah.
And the thing is, those are not mutually exclusive ideas either. What is actually going to maximize the number of hard sets you're going to do over that 10 years? It might actually still be the higher volume approach, but when you layer all the practical considerations onto it, the lower volume approach in the short term leads to the higher volume approach over 10 years. And that's the thing that I think people don't often conceptualize.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to like when we, like, I think as like science-based trainees or whatever you want to call us, like I think we have this tendency, at least I do, to see people as like robots, where it's like you just go in and do the thing, right? 100%. And even I see myself as that. It's like, I'll do whatever is going to give me the best gains, right? But like, when you're in the gym for like 2.5 hours, like you just do start to drag your feet, like as much as you don't want to. Like there's only so much discipline I think you can tap into, especially as you get deeper in your career. So like for me, when I switched to just doing like 2 hard sets per exercise, like, bro, I loved it for one thing. The vibes were fantastic. The workouts were so good. And even though I think I was pushing myself hard on the higher volume plan, like I think I would let the excuses kind of like insert themselves subconsciously. 100%. And like I just wouldn't tap into that like next level, which sounds corny, but like I nonetheless think it was true 100%. In my case.
So here's an area of research I think is probably the most underrated or most overlooked area of research. And it's not really in like our strength and hypertrophy niche. It's a little bit more in like the psychology endurance training type research world. And that's of pacing. I actually think I've heard you describe this as the focus effect, which is I think will resonate a little bit more. But the way that I've seen it described in the research is called pacing. So there's a really good researcher, last name Halperin, and he had a series of studies in like the mid 2010s on this, and they had some really creative designs to display this concept. So they had big caveat here, and this might apply when we circle back to like the practical implications of this. They were untrained folks, but there were a few conditions, but the ones most relevant here was the control condition and a deception condition. So the control condition, they came into the lab and they did 12 maximal isometric bicep contractions. So imagine you're doing like a preacher curl as hard as you can, but the preacher curl machine doesn't move and you're measuring the force, right? So you're basically doing, and I think they held it for like 5 seconds, rested a little bit, and then went again. right? So they did that 12 times, and then you're able to measure the force across those 12 reps. And in that control condition, they told them, hey, that's what you're going to do. You're going to do this 12 times, right? There was another condition, and it's called the deception condition. They did the same thing. They also did those 12 maximal contractions, but they told them you're only going to do 6. Guess what happened on that 6th rep in the deception condition?
I think they went super hard on it.
They went super hard.
Yeah.
Right? The control condition on that 6th rep, they were like, oh, I got 6 more. The researchers are yelling at me to go as hard as I can.
Every single one.
But I'm subconsciously going to leave a little bit in the tank. But in the deception condition, where they're like, no, this is the last one, they're going to finish strong. And the difference was like 6% in terms of force production. Wow. So again, this focus effect or this pacing effect, I think is something that plays out acutely. I also think it plays out like chronically over a training career. Again, like to put my practitioner hat on, I know as a trainee and as a coach, it can be tough when you're running from responsibility to responsibility and you're looking down the barrel of a 2.5-hour training session. It's hard to lay it all out there and get after it. But if you have, hey, I got 45 minutes, an hour, maybe 70 minutes to get after it, to go as hard as possible, man, you can smash it. And maybe, again, you do, like, in a way, maximize your dose response curve over a longer time period.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Yeah. I mean, so I did my little like practical critique of this paper, even though again, like to be clear, I think it's fantastic. It's like the best that's out on this, right?
But that's key. But practical critique,
yeah,
right?
100%,
Sure. There's a ton.
And I had 3 things. Okay. I think it was 3. So the first one was that most of these studies that look at number of sets per muscle per week and gains, so volume versus gains, are only looking at 1, maybe 2 muscles at a time. So we don't know if, and it seems to be true that, like, yes, the more sets you do, the more gains you make. Now that's marginal, so it starts to like diminish after a certain point, right? But still, more sets, more gains, right? But that's in 1 muscle at a time. They're not training every muscle like that. So I think a mistake some people make is they then take that and say, okay, well, ipso facto, if I do 30 sets for every muscle, I'm going to make better total body gains. Like, I don't think that's a safe assumption. In fact, I would say that might actually not be true. Not even to mention, is it sustainable or not?
Yeah. The short answer is we don't know, because we don't have, like you said, in this data set, there were some full body programs, but on average, they were not. So that's a great point. Typically what labs will do is maybe they'll test 2 muscles and they'll give like some standardized training for the rest of the body that's like pretty low volume.
Yeah.
So, going back to my question of, hey, how do you increase your biceps muscle thickness over the next 10 weeks? You might not put nearly as much time and effort into your quad training, right?
Yeah.
And you're definitely going to train your biceps first in the session.
Yeah, totally.
So I think the same concept applies here.
Good. Yeah. Okay. The other critique I had was that most of these studies are done at or around maintenance calories or in a surplus. And so I'd be curious like how that might change in a deficit. So for me, while cutting, I had a fantastic experience with low volume training. But if I was going to put myself in a surplus where I'm trying to like optimize muscle growth again, I feel like this might be more relevant. So just, briefly, like, do you think that there is an asterisk there when it comes to like deficit versus surplus versus maintenance?
Again, this is probably a theme. The short answer is we don't know. If memory serves from this data set, there was 1 study where they were purposefully in a deficit. So we just don't have those direct comparisons, deficit versus surplus. Now, again, just me using conjecture, speculating a bit. The way that I think about it is this relationship is probably similar. Like the nature of the relationship is probably similar, whether you're in a deficit, maintenance, or surplus. The magnitude of the growth will just change. And I think it's very reasonable to expect, in fact, I would hypothesize this is the case, is that if you're in a deficit, your muscle growth will be capped. Right? Like at this point, if you're in a deficit, it would like you can probably grow, as your data seem to indicate.
Yeah.
But you're not gonna like increase your muscle thickness by 10 to 15%.
Even growth, I think, is like a bit of a reach.
Exactly.
I think the growth I might have seen was probably just like catch up growth from like muscle, not like catch up, like catching up from growth that I probably lost from like focusing on business, not training as hard, yada, yada, right? I think but that's also still fine. Like I said, it's nice to get gains.
I'm trying to remain optimistic. I'm trying to remain optimistic.
No.
But either way.
But I think this actually just like feeds into my point, which is that like if you're in a deficit, like if your gains are capped, then like why are you doing all of this volume when you could like, get the same effect with less?
So if you take like, someone that's been training for 2 years, they can grow a lot, and therefore they might benefit from higher volumes more than a more advanced trainee. Here's another thing. At this point, you've been training for a very long time, and you're probably just more skilled at training and eliciting a hypertrophy stimulus from a given set. I think that is just something that comes with time and might not be perfectly represented here. So I've just anecdotally recognized that more advanced trainees can kind of almost get away with less sets because they can make any given set more potent. And then you layer on the deficit. I'm not surprised at all by your experience.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, let's like make this a bit more practical. Sure. I'm going to give you 3 different examples. One is a beginner, one is an intermediate, and one is like super advanced. Okay. And by super advanced, I don't mean like pro bodybuilder. I just mean like they've been training for a long time. Okay. Beginner is first year. Intermediate is like year 1 to 3, something like that. Okay. How many sets per muscle per week for the beginner?
So the thing I was going to say before you started this is that I think the thing that he was alluding to that I think is a little bit more concrete to lay out, and then I'll let you answer this, is that I think by executing your sets better, I think the dose response relationship doesn't necessarily change. But if you go from not executing your sets as potently, you improve that, the absolute numbers of the volumes that you're going to probably utilize are going to drop.
Right.
So it's seeming like you're decreasing your volume and the dose response relationship is actually coming downwards. But if your sets are all getting more potent, now the dose response relationship is still existing, but you're occurring at a lower overall set volume. So that's relevant for this question because we probably need to assume that all the sets are being adequately performed with high effort, adequate execution, those kind of things. So I'll let you take that.
That's a good point. To answer your question about like set volume recommendations for beginner, intermediate, advanced, there are some hesitations with exact numbers, and I really think of this stuff conceptually. And I'm going to give you my conceptual recommendation, and then if you really want to tie my arm down, and I'll give you numbers if you make me. But conceptually, and I think this applies to beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So hopefully I can acknowledge all those at once. The kind of conceptual recommendation that I've landed on is more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you. So there's no inverted U here. There's no point where we start to see worse hypertrophy from additional sets in the research with the limitations and the selection bias that we mentioned. But there very well could be a practical inverted U. The practical inverted U is you start resenting training, you start sandbagging your sets, you fall off, you're like, oh shoot, I'm off program, so I'm just gonna, skip this workout. And practically your muscle growth gets worse. But again, the research is not designed to necessarily test that, right? This shows that kind of underlying physiological relationship. So I think you could go to a beginner, you could go to an intermediate person, you could go to an advanced trainee, and you could say more is better with a smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against you. And I think if you take that conceptually, I think people can come to their own conclusions after experimenting with themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to put some numbers on this. Like
sure.
the standard science-based number was always like 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week. Do you like it or no?
Practically, I find myself a little bit lower than that.
Yeah. Okay.
For both myself and for...
Ironic, right?
TikTok is going to love this, bro. They are so vindicated right now. That's crazy.
I find myself like I'm very much of the belief that the number one predictor is going to be just staying in the game for a while and ticking lifestyle boxes and doing hard progressive training. And I think that volume is not necessarily like driving that process. I think there is
it's a multiplier.
Yeah, it's a multiplier, and that multiplier gets smaller and smaller as you do more.
It's not the signal.
So I find myself more in like the 5 to 15 range. I think if you sustain that, that's awesome. Now, at the same time, if someone came to me and said, hey, I have 12 months before my next bodybuilding season and I'm a really advanced natural trainee and I have all the time in the world to dedicate to this, you better believe we're going to go above 15.
Sure.
Right? So
yeah, sure. Especially for certain muscles, right? Like I find, I don't know, just anecdotally, like I just find like the back can recover pretty well.
That's like the machines we use, right? Like just think about the average equipment. That's what I mean about like thinking about the quality of the stimulus you're getting from a given set changes the numbers.
Yeah.
If you go from training at LA Fitness, I'm not sure what is in Toronto, what the equivalent is, but utilizing all the normal back machines that they have access to, or you come here and you utilize all the prime equipment with the length and bias loaded resistance challenge, maybe some additional sauce on the end of those sets. The absolute number of sets that you might be doing might be different, but from a stimulus perspective, we can kind of look at that as a rough proxy. It might be roughly similar, right? So that part of things is really, really important when you talk about the set volume. Is it's all contingent upon what actually constitutes a set. And when you're completely changing the exercise selection you have access to and things, that can completely change the numbers, but it can still be high or low volume relative to those kind of things.
Great. Okay. I'm going to just circle back because I did say I had 3 critiques. The third one we kind of just got into, which was basically that like these studies usually last like 8 to 12, maybe at most 20 weeks. Yep. And so like we just simply, I think, don't know what would happen over time. So over a long time. So let's just say like 1 to 10 years, we don't really know if the higher volume group continues to be ahead or if they both kind of get to the same point and it starts to level off, right? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's like talking about the top 5 things in exercise science that we need to know, but we don't know, is the idea that do all of the approaches that we investigate in the typical timeframes of 8 to 16 weeks, are those simply increasing the rate to get to the same point, or are they actually allowing us to reach a higher point? Now, I'm going to actually push that to the side for a second and actually maybe suggest why that actually doesn't matter. Is the idea, the comparison between those things is entirely contingent upon the fact that we actually reach that plateau. If we actually reach that plateau, then really all we're talking about is getting there faster. But if that plateau is pretty elusive and it requires us staying in the game for 20, 30 years and just getting really, really diminishing returns, we never actually reach it. So then getting faster gains actually is getting more gains at the same time. So there's a lot of little bits and pieces of this that kind of change the game a little bit. And we often like to say, like, it's pretty rare people are actually going to hit a true plateau with the amount of time that they would need to invest to kind of get to that point. So then a lot of these strategies that we can utilize to increase the rate of growth probably does end up helping you from a practical sense. But it's a fantastic question and it's super interesting to kind of think about it from that perspective. But yeah, I don't have a super firm answer. I don't know if you have.
I agree with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I think we've been talking in the volume discussion a lot about like sets per muscle per week. In my experience, people kind of have a hard time like wrapping their heads around what that looks like on paper. And so sometimes I like to think about like volume per workout. So let's do this a couple ways, right? Like let's just say I'm doing a chest day, all right? And I've got machine chest press, and then I've got cable flies. Okay. Now I have the option to do 1 set on each of those, 2 sets on each of those, 3 sets on each of those, 4 sets on each of those, 5 sets on each of those. All right. My main goal is muscle growth. How many sets should I do on each exercise? Like, are you like the person who like rocks with like just 1 all out set Dorian Yates style? Do you like 2 all out sets, which is kind of more like, I'll call it TikTok style right now. And then 3 to 4 all out sets, which is more like, what do I even call that other corner? Let's just call that like the higher volume, 3 to 5. What are you doing?
I'm assuming we're probably going to train this muscle group 2 to 3 times a week. Is that
let's say 2 times a week? Most people do like an upper lower split or a push pull leg split.
Perfect. So if we're training twice a week, I would say that this is something that I don't think is super well bore out in the research. So the researcher hat off, a little bit of the practitioner hat on. I think there probably is pretty strong within session diminishing returns of a given exercise. This is where I think some of the anecdotes of hitting things from multiple angles, multiple resistance profiles, those kind of things probably do end up being something that makes a difference in the long run. So I would probably start to cap the per exercise volume. I think we were talking about this the other day. I don't know the last time I prescribed more than 4 or 5 sets per an exercise. So I'd probably 4 would probably be my max. So that's hitting like 8 sets per session. And doing that twice a week would probably be where I would go. But then if you're hitting 8 to 10 sets within a session for a muscle, I'm probably going to start to increase the frequency if I want to try to increase the total volume that I'm hitting in a given week. So that's probably where I would go. But I would say I don't want to get too many sets for a given exercise. I would probably add another exercise in, even from a practical standpoint, because I find, going back to your focus effect, your 6th set of machine chest press, I think that exacerbates the issues with higher volume training, as opposed to, even if you stay in the high volume side of things, but if you still take your approach of 2 sets per exercise, but you did more exercise within a given session, I bet that with the same volume of a more lower exercise variety routine, I bet the overall focus that you would have is much higher for the multiple set approach. That said, the last caveat, because I bet you're probably about to say this, that the studies that we do have in the data set, they do have pretty high exercise per exercise volumes, if I'm understanding that. So the point about exercise variety, that's more from my practical experience to kind of layer that things on. But yeah, that'd be my answer. Probably 4 sets to kind of bring it back to your
4
question.
sets each exercise?
That'd probably be the cap.
Yeah. Oh, that would be the cap.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're looking at, so let's say Monday we hit chest press and cable fly. Then Thursday we hit bench press and dip, or I don't know, dumbbell fly.
I would probably have somebody do 2 sets per exercise, 2-3 sets per exercise, but more exercises if I was programming them.
You would add a little more variety to that, but you would still end it at around 8 sets,
8 to 10 sets per session
in that workout. And so, all right. So that is actually like the high end of what I would actually recommend. Again, from a practice, we can split hairs over this all day long about like, is 2 better, is 4 better, whatever. But this kind of leads nicely into the idea of junk volume, which, I think there's a few ways you could define it. Let's just say it's sets that you do that aren't actually in a workout.
Sure.
So sets that you do in a workout that aren't actually doing anything significant for hypertrophy anymore.
Sure.
Right. So I'd probably speculate that, like, for most people, you start running into junk volume after, probably around 8, maybe 10 sets for a muscle in a workout. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So we actually, shout out to our colleague, Jake Remmert. We had another meta-analysis where we used the same data set as the volume and frequency meta-analyses that we've talked about, but we looked at it from kind of a slightly different angle, so per session volumes. And this does require some subjective input about at what point is it no longer clear that you get additional benefit from doing an additional set in a workout? So the term that Jake used in that paper is the PUOS, the point of undetectable outcome superiority. And we're not gonna get into the
super practical.
Yeah, we're not gonna get into the details of like how we landed on that, but basically it's around 11 fractional sets,
Direct,
which includes indirect sets as half a set. But you can think of it as like, if you do some back of the napkin math, it's about 8 direct sets in a workout.
Okay.
So all of that is to say is, to answer your question about like number of sets for a muscle in a given session, once you get to that like 8 to 10 range, you could do more. It doesn't seem like there's a huge downside from a physiological perspective, but you're also rolling the dice that it just might not give you any benefit at all. So again, from a researcher perspective, that 8 to 10 range is kind of where I would land as a cap.
Good. So I want to talk about like minimalism with volume 2, because I think like, and this is something that frustrates me even about like my own older content and some of the newer content and just the science-based space in general, is that like we are kind of inherently like optimizer types, whereas like 90+% of people just want to make gains and go about the rest of their lives, right? So it's like, what should the science-based message be here? Should it be like, you should do this with the implicit assumption being to maximize your gains, or should it be, you should do this to make gains while not having to spend all day in the gym? I would say, like, if anything, it should be the latter, because that's what most people want, right?
Can I give you an analogy?
Sure.
Let's say you get a new job. And at that job, they say, hey, we're not going to pay you a salary or an hourly rate. We're going to do something a little bit different. Instead, and I got this idea from a colleague, Troy Taylor. So shout out to Troy. Can't take credit for his idea. But basically, the idea is, okay, instead of paying you hourly for the first 5 hours that you work this week, we're going to pay you $100 an hour. For the next 5 hours, so hours 6 to 10, we're going to pay you $80 an hour. And on it goes, right? Hours 11 to 15, we're going to pay you $60 an hour. If your goal is to make as much money as possible, and maybe you have some things you got to pay off, or whatever the case is based on your situation, or you just have the time, you might still work an 80-hour work week, even if at the end you're barely making any additional money, but you're trying to squeeze out everything you can. But if, like you said, your constraints in a lifting context is that like, hey, I'm trying to get a high return on my investment, right? I'm trying to make sure every hour in the gym I'm getting a lot out of it. You might work part-time, right, in that job. So I think people can think of their time in the gym, their volume, in a similar way.
Now, okay, I love that analogy, but I don't know, and you would know better than me, but like, do we want to tweak those numbers at all? Because
then
what was it?
Don't overthink the numbers.
Okay. No, but I think it matters though, because that would change my intuition on it, right?
Yeah.
So like, let's just say, okay, for the first 5 hours at this job, they're paying me, what is it, $100 an hour?
Yeah.
Okay, now but then if I want to work another 5 hours, I think it might be more like, we'll pay you $50 an hour. It gets cut in half, right? Yeah. And then if I'm going to go and work 15 hours, now I'm making $25 an hour.
Yeah.
Okay. Now if I'm going to work 20 hours, now I'm making $7 or wait, no, where did I get? Where did I leave off? 25. It'd be 12 and a half hours or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's basically getting cut in half every single time.
So in our dose response curve, we investigated up to, let's call it 30 just to make it relatively simple. So from 0 sets per week to 30 sets per week. Roughly speaking, those sets early in the dose response relationship, so the first 5 or so, are about 3 times as effective as the sets at the end of the dose response relationship.
Yeah. That's huge though.
Huge.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean, underappreciated aspect of this.
You're doing, so in order to get the benefits of your initial sets, you have to do 3 at the end of the dose response relationship. And keep in mind, you've already done a bunch of volume before then, right?
Yeah.
The other thing about this too that I think goes vastly underappreciated too is, unlike your guys' scenario about the income example, you can look at your bank account and immediately verify whether or not you have more money. The entire process of training for hypertrophy is dictated on our perception. Perceptible gains are not the same thing as I can verify my gains in Jeff Nippard's awesome lab with all the measurement techniques. Cool, I can go up to my grandma on Thanksgiving and show her my ultrasound scan and said I make gains, but the ultimate arbiter is, do you look
Does
bigger?
Granny notice?
Exactly. Yeah. Are you looking snugger in your Christmas sweater or whatever it ends up being? So when you layer that on top of it, I think that's ultimately the equalizer, and where I think a lot of the anecdotes can kind of be rectified is that when you have that part of things that I'm sure in your experiment, there were probably parts of your brain, no matter what those scans said, there was certain things that you kind of just felt were true based on your perception.
Sure.
And the exact same thing can be true of saying, I just did 3 times the amount of work and I don't feel like I got that much out of it, but that amount of payoff could be perfectly expected by this dose response relationship. Totally. It's just so small, it doesn't cross the perception window that makes it seem as if this was not really worth it.
Yeah, this is such a good point that like speaks to my soul, because this is such a problem that I've had with like all of the exercise science literature, is that we don't see photos. We don't know what these people look like. We don't see the gains. So if I hear, oh, you saw 37% more growth with such and such. It's like, all right, what does that look like? You know, and I think that people want to know that. 100%. So like that was a huge motivation for me building the lab, 100%. Is that like now I can show people the before and after, and I can do this over a longer time frame too, so people get a more realistic picture of what we're actually talking about, right? Because if it's hypertrophy that we're talking about,
that's the outcome.
That's ultimately a kind of a visual thing. I mean, we care about it for health reasons and all these other things too, but like usually it's more to do with aesthetics and size.
100%.
So I think that's an absolutely fantastic point. Just because it's significant on paper doesn't necessarily mean it's visually noticeable.
100%.
Right? And a lot of the visual differences, I guess unfortunately, I suppose, does come down to like uncontrollable variables, like just your genetic capacity for muscle growth, your starting size, your limb lengths and ratios 100%. And proportions and muscle bellies and insertions and all this kind of stuff. So like, that's never going to be picked up here. Like you might see twice the gains, but like if you have half as good muscle insertions as a bodybuilder, that you might not actually be doing better than somebody who made significantly less gains than you, right? So that is a big point that I totally resonate with. Okay, so let's address this thing that I actually am not sure about myself. One thing I'll hear a lot, especially from people who are like kind of deep into this stuff, is like, oh, the reason you have this rift, right, where like some people are saying high intensity, low volume is the way to go. Other people are saying high volume, low intensity is the way to go. Is that like people just respond differently? So like some people just legitimately do better with higher intensity, lower volume. Other people legitimately do better with lower intensity, higher volume. And so like everyone is just arguing and kind of like talking past one another. And it's like they can both kind of be right. It's like some people might do better with this approach. Some people might do better with that approach. What do you think of that?
So this was the topic of my PhD.
Okay.
And it's something I'm super, super passionate about. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this topic is extremely challenging to study. So let me just paint a super common example of how this stuff plays out. And this was me before my PhD. I did it all the time. And even in the beginning of my PhD, this is exactly what I did. New paper comes out. It's an awesome within subject design. One limb uses low volume, one limb uses high volume. So that means within a given person, I can see, is the lower volume limb responding better than the higher volume limb or vice versa? And you can very clearly see, like you said, you see that nice normal distribution of responses. Some people do way better with higher volumes. Some people do way better with lower volumes. The intuition there is to immediately assign that to that is the true reality of the situation. Well, let's just pause for a second. Let's say we had a normal study, group A versus group B. If there was a single person in either one of those groups, you say that study's useless, right? And so coming back to our original study, you have to treat every single person as their own individual study, essentially. So having one measurement really doesn't tell you reality. And that's because if I were to take you and complete that exact same study 100 times in a row, totally independent of whether you do better with higher or lower volumes, there's going to be a ton of variability. And so when you take that one snapshot of a given study, we're looking at one time this happened with a given set of sleep variables, nutrition variables, et cetera, that are all essentially random. So what I did for my dissertation project was essentially what's called a replication study. So they do the first phase where they did a within participant design, they perform a washout period, and then they do it again. And essentially what we saw is that the responses of higher or lower volumes didn't seem to really be reliable. And so essentially what that's suggesting is that anytime you look at a snapshot here, that isn't the ground truth of the matter. We kind of need to see how that would play out over multiple cases to see if that's a true, predictable, stable characteristic of the individual rather than essentially being artifact.
Hold on. So you did a study. So you did one
twice.
study. Yeah, you did the study twice. So the first one was within subject design.
Correct.
So they had, was it arms, quads? Quads. Okay. So they had one quad where they did high volume, another quad where they did low volume. Okay. Then you washed out for what, 2 weeks?
6 to 8 weeks.
6 to 8 weeks. So they just didn't train at all.
Nope. Went back to habitual training.
Correct. Okay. And then you ran that exact same study again for what, 12 weeks?
Yeah, it's a 11-week intervention.
Okay. And the same people did so they did one leg.
There's a couple different
low volume.
Some
and high
people
volume?
crossed over. Some people did the same thing. There's a couple different, but yes, essentially they did the same thing.
You basically just ran it back.
Exactly.
All right. What did you find in the first one?
So
The first study,
basically,
was there an effect of higher volume? Like
overall, there
was an overall effect of higher volume. But what you're saying is, if there was someone in this group and his name was Joe, Joe might have seen better gains on the high volume leg in study 1, but he might have seen better gains in the low volume leg in study 2.
Bingo.
Really?
Yes.
So
the one thing I'll say is that one study, this area of research, whatever sample sizes you think are necessary to detect group differences, it's way more for this. But really the big point that I wanted to do this project for, once I kind of understand some of the conceptual issues with this topic, is it is purely a philosophical point to say, looking at the variability from a single phase or a single, like typically the way that we do, is not sufficient to say this person is a high volume responder or a low volume responder.
It's not the way it seems on the surface.
It's not the way it seems.
Okay, so let's just say Joe, he was like super stressed out, or let's just say he was like chilling in block 1, study 1. So he could do the high volume. He's recovering from it. He's making great gains. His nutrition's really good. In block 2, he's got this like super stressful relationship thing or work thing or
there's
whatever.
So many factors
so
like that.
So the high volume just had him like overreaching or something weird, and he did better on the
or other just
volume.
random biological things. There's just so many factors that just kind of get swept under the surface.
What might those other biological things be? Like, are you talking like hormonal balance?
Sure. I mean,
stuff,
it's literally infinite. Like I can come up with a bunch, but like things related to the measurement, whether somebody rode their bike
there
that time.
Be like human measurement error that goes outside of the error bars parameters of the device you're using, though, right? Like you're not saying like the experimenter basically just like mess it up.
Here's an example. Let's say that one time when you measured their muscle size, they walked to the lab. Another time they drove.
Right. It's little things like that.
Seriously.
Okay.
Measurement drift for the same investigator. There's all sorts of aspects of variability that are unrelated to the training intervention itself. And so like the easiest way to think about it is
It's underappreciated.
if you went and just ran the same program 100 times in a row, there's going to be a ton of variability within that exact same training program. Sure.
Yeah.
But a hypothetical world where they're all at the same time, there's still going to be some random variation that's occurring between those situations.
That's surprising and counterintuitive, though.
It is extremely counterintuitive, and it's why it's one of the most
So let me ask you this. What's your takeaway from that? Is your takeaway? Hold on, I'm trying to like think about this.
It took him 5 years to come up with a takeaway.
Yeah. So like the takeaway could be like the takeaway could be quite fatalistic and be like, these studies are not really telling us stuff as reliably as we think they are, because you even run back the same thing with the same people and you see different things. No? Okay. So what it is telling you is that in one individual in a study, we can't necessarily say one approach is better than the other, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So that's fine. That's a methodological thing.
Yeah.
So since you did when did you finish your PhD?
A year and a half ago.
Okay. So since then, or even, you've had time obviously to think about this whole thing.
Long time.
Like, I see the point where it's like, it's hard to say if one training style would be better or worse for this person because they might be sleeping different, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But let's just say, like, it's somebody like me. I actually do sleep pretty consistently.
Yeah.
I actually do have pretty consistent levels of stress. Like, I work remotely. I'm going to control every variable as much as humanly possible, right?
Yep.
Like, it seems to me like kind of like obvious that like there would be a training approach that would be better for me versus worse than me, right?
Yep.
So like,
so first and foremost, all of your intuition, this was shared by me, this was shared by him, this was shared by my committee. It's a very unintuitive topic. The first thing I'll say is that a lot of these concerns and a lot of these kind of approaches of looking at this topic come from medicine. So medicine is way more highly funded, way more, the implications of it are way more broad, and a lot of the same things occur. And so like personalized medicine, for example, there's a lot of medical statisticians that are extremely skeptical of that concept, for example, which seems like something that's just so obvious that we should do.
Sure.
But when you layer on a lot of these things, it's a lot less intuitive than it seems. So that's the first thing I'll say. Now, let's just talk practically. So from my perspective, the more that I've kind of zoomed out and thought about this, I personally think it makes quite a bit of sense, honestly. So when you think about comparing two different training approaches, to me, in a practical sense, you absolutely can have somebody who has better results with lower volumes than they do with higher volumes. But the key is, it's probably not due to the inherent differences in the response to the training program. The differences is their overall life context. That's typically, from my perspective, the thing that's going to probably drive that difference. Now, again, the caveat being one study, et cetera. But from a practical point of view, that's kind of how I view it. So underneath the hood, the way that I see it is that these dose-response relationships that we've been talking about, for the most part, I think those are going to probably operate under the hood for pretty much everybody. Meaning, if you are able to tolerate it, more training is probably going to lead to better results. The key being, though, that's not an assumption that's always held. That fluctuates all the time, and some people have objectively different life contexts than somebody else that probably can over time lead to these diverging narratives on top of the perception problem that we talked about earlier.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is like, sure, there might be differences in terms of how individuals respond to high volume versus low volume. But those differences are probably not coming from some inherent genetic thing. Right. Instead, it's coming from like lifestyle, nutrition, sleep.
Same observation, probably same practical thing, but it is distinctly different. And it has some important implications for troubleshooting.
More is better, smaller and smaller payoff until it starts working against
Exactly.
And,
okay,
that can change.
Yeah, okay. All right. But here, hold on, let me wrap my head around this. So let's just say we took, let's just say we took 10 people, okay? And they all are like millionaires without a job, and like they have no stress in the world, and like they can completely control, like they're just the perfect subject, okay? Yep. And like they're all going to be like metabolic chambered, and they're going to eat exactly the same calories, they're going to burn exactly the same, everything is like perfectly okay, blah blah blah.
Yep.
And then so we have 10 people. of those 10 people, everything else is controlled for.
Yep.
How many of them do you think build more muscle in 12 weeks on a high volume program versus a low volume program? So that is to say, like, let me reframe this. Hold on. This is like a new thought.
Yeah.
So I think what people would think online is that like maybe half of them
50-50.
would do better with low volume, high intensity.
Yeah.
The other half would do better with high volume, high intensity. Even if all the lifestyle and everything is controlled for, some people just really do seem to do better with lower volume, high intensity. Some people seem to do better with high volume, high intensity. And since you hear like roughly equal screaming from both sides of those debate, it probably does split down the middle. So let's just say like standard guess would be 5 people do better with a low volume, 5 people do better with high volume.
Yep.
How many people out of those 10 do you think would do better with low volume? And how many out of those 10 do you think would do better with high volume?
So the way I'll answer this is that I think the answer I feel actually really good about, and like the one that I'm the most confident is I think the variability would be far less than people expect, because the true amount of variation that you're thinking about there is not the thing that people see or associate with typically the way that they read studies. I'm confident in that answer. Now, the next answer is when you say do better with high volume or do better with low volume, that implies detecting that. So that's the next part you have to kind of layer on top of it. Just because someone has a 0.001% difference in favor of high volume, do we really consider that a win for high volume or not? So you kind of have to consider the error of the situation there. So what I'll say is that I think the variation that is ascribed to high volume responders and low volume responders is substantially smaller than people think. Right. And I think the variation ascribed to these fluctuation and random differences, whether that be psychological approaches to training, all the other things that you mentioned that were controlled, but that's a very clear factor in the real world, I think that is much larger than people expect. So when you would actually go through the formal process of testing this, I'm pretty committed to the idea that, I don't know if you've ever heard of kind of the black swan fallacy, but basically if someone says there are no black swans and I find one black swan, my entire theory is disproven. I'd never really want to go on record and say there absolutely is no such thing as a high volume or low volume responder because it's so easily disproven. But I think it is substantially less than people expect.
Really? So wait, so you would say, it sounds to me like you're saying like, if you're using like the black swan, white swan analogy, like you're basically saying that like pretty much like most people by far just would respond better in a vacuum to high volume training.
That'd be my prediction if we could measure that tactically.
And the real reason why we see those differences is that some people are just like more stressed, or psychological differences. They push harder on low volume, like I just did. All these sorts of like less tangible
The larger
things.
Contributing source of variation is probably be that. That'd be my assumption. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Which seems to be the case in, like I said, in other areas. So it's
okay. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, when you said like there wouldn't be as much variability as you think, what you're saying there is variability within per individual.
I guess
right?
think of
because
that.
you would see, if we had 10 random people come in, you would see, I think, drastically different actual gains. But within each individual, if we were to run it back, wash out, run it, blah, 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 we wouldn't see much variability there. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that's interesting.
No. Even the former is overstated, though. It's the same kind of concept.
Yeah, okay.
It's you look at the kind of some of the classic studies that kind of look at the distribution of training responses, the same exact thing occurs. So often what they don't do in those studies is sometimes there's a control group. And so there's a distribution of training responses that looks almost identical to the ones of the other groups. So usually what you actually have to do is to compare the distributions of the control and the resistance training group, which once again is going to slightly decrease the amount of true variability that you would see. Now, even for my dissertation study, we did see more detectable evidence of what I'd call just general response variation. So Jeff responds better to training than me, that kind of thing. But within Jeff or within myself, we saw much less evidence of the high volume versus low volume responder, which to me, that generally tracks with my intuition in the sense that, again, going back to your analogy, which I think is really helpful for just like making people that obsess over the details kind of put your money where your mouth is and really kind of crystallize your thoughts, is like, okay, if you were going to take anybody and have them try to grow as much as they could in 15 weeks, what are you going to have them do? I'm probably going to have them train as hard as they can that they can tolerate, right? It's not really going to depend too much on individual level characteristics outside of what they can tolerate. And that's really the key determinant on determining what volume they should do.
Okay, hold on. One other thing there, because like this is kind of new to me. I feel these are good takes, but like they're a little bit either new or I haven't heard them. Or
trust me, I was very surprised in my PhD process.
He's done a 180 from the outside.
This hasn't really leached out much into the broader space. Okay, so wait, so like we've all seen these graphs where it's like you put I don't know, 30 people on the same exact training program and you see like massive differences in gains, right? Now, I think the main takeaway from that is that just look how much of a difference genetics makes.
Yep.
Are you saying that like you actually don't think it's so much genetics and it's more so that like maybe person 17 just like slept really well or had less, I don't know, stress or, maybe actually trained a little harder, blah, blah, blah. Like, are you saying that it's actually those other variables and it's not so much genetics?
So to me, this is the kind of the way that I would describe that component of it. Far and away, the component of talent or genetics that I think is going to predominate that kind of conversation is where you start. So post maturation, your physique kind of before, let's we have a group of 10 million people. They don't train up through high school. They're 18 now. They're fully developed. They're fully matured. There's going to be a huge variation of individuals. That's genetics to me, predominantly.
Okay.
After that, there seems to be a little bit of variability in the average training response to just training in general, but much less than people think. From the data that we have, again, it's limited. I try not to get into too much of the nerd details, but baseline is the vast majority. Training response is a little bit after that. It seems to be overstated for the most part. And then after that, we have differences between different training interventions, which seems to be even probably smaller than that. And if you just think about it conceptually, the absolute effect that we're dealing with is decreasing in each one of those scenarios. So the variability that can kind of go alongside that, assuming all training responses are relatively positive, is also going to kind of shrink. And that's kind of the general approach that seems to be the holding true the most. Is you have this massive distribution of people at baseline. There's variability, at least in my study. Some other studies would disagree in our area, but there seems to be, and I would bet that there's some variability just to training generally. And then after that, we don't have very many studies that look at between different interventions that actually use one of these robust approaches to make sure we're identifying the thing that we care about.
So then how would you explain this, right? Because I'm sure you've seen people who start out quite thin, and then in their first 3 years of training, they put on like 30 pounds of muscle, right? And you see other people who start out quite thin, and then in their first 3 years of training, they put on like 5-10 pounds of muscle. So I would attribute that to genetic differences, right? Like myostatin, whatever the actual genes are, we may not know, but like there's something going on that is on the nature side, not the nurture side. Do you think that that's the case?
So I think there's a couple of things going on there that I think are often not bared all the way out. So anytime we observe an anecdote like that, of course, we only see certain parts of the conversation that they describe. The entire backdrop of all these random variables is often not discussed. So coming back to the maturation piece, what if they were low SES, didn't have the ability to actually fully mature in their kind of early years? So now when they start training and they kind of are able to fully mature, those coincide. So there's other aspects of the conversation. Now, I'll be the first to say, again, I really try hard not to put down any black swans because it just is so easy to overstate these things. But the thing I'm most confident in is that the variability that we attribute to those things, I think, is probably overestimated based on those sort of things. I'm not to say it's zero, not to say there's certain cases where that definitely isn't a major factor, probably is the case. But in general, and kind of the standard approaches to using evidence to support those claims, I think those are typically made with data that really can't answer that question for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting because like when you look at the male versus female data, like I think most people would say—
Perfect example. That's a perfect example. People think about the biggest thing that would separate individuals, sex. We see the same relative growth.
See the same relative
and
growth.
That's one of the easiest things you can point to say genetics, hormones, all these sorts of things that you would say. Of course, I think a lot of people would come back and say the variation within sex is greater than the variation between sex. But let's table that for a second and just take these massive groups of people that on paper have vastly different genetics. Same relative training response. And that's the same kind of concept we're getting at here, is that if you look at the variation there, it's probably overestimated than what's actually happening underneath the hood. Yeah,
in case people aren't up to speed on that, like I think the latest data on this suggests that like men basically just like start out with more muscle than women, but they gain the same amount of muscle relative to their starting lean mass. So like the actual relative gains are similar. That's actually a really good point. Now, I'm still like a little skeptical.
We are too. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Trust me.
So I'm just curious. Like this is really eye-opening. I'd love to see more in the way of like genetic research, because if we could identify genes and see them being expressed more in other people, then like sorry, you're cooked. Like that's direct evidence of a difference in genetic response,
well, this
right?
is the interesting thing. So at least from my perspective, again, I've definitely like thought a lot about this, and I kind of fall on this one side of the camp. So I try not to take too hard to one position, but even let's say that we have that study. So let's say we take another 16-week study, we have all these molecular markers and we evaluate those in response to the intervention. What's to say that that isn't just what happened that time? There's nothing you can really say. Now, of course, I think some of those things are substantially more robust, and I think we have a lot of data on terms of those genetic markers. But the next thing I'll say, this is probably the point that I think makes more sense, is, and this is just the classic mechanistics versus outcome data, is when you think about isolated mechanisms, at least in this kind of an area, we always validate those mechanisms with respect to the outcome data, right? That's kind of the way that you validate a mechanism, is making sure that it does verify with whatever outcome that you're trying to manipulate. We may measure certain mechanisms, but if we have this outcome data that seems to suggest that the variability maybe is a little bit overestimated, what if there are other mechanisms that we didn't measure that, because those vary, but they may counteract one another to lead to similar outcomes?
So tell me about those other mechanisms then, because like because this seems like kind of like a black box in the way that you're describing it, right? Because like I can think of a few things like nutrition. Okay, but nutrition is usually like, at least calories are usually controlled for in these studies, right?
Within subjects ones would be. Yeah, I think calorie intake a lot of the time is not super robustly controlled. Like they try to, make sure that people aren't in varied dietary patterns, but I won't say it's super rigorous.
So that could be a big one, but like if you're not seeing like huge swings in weight differences between yada yada, like, that's probably not. I mean, that can be a huge one, don't get me wrong, but like if there's any effort made to control it at all, that doesn't, again, this is just like totally a gut thing. It doesn't seem like it would override genetics, right? All right, what might be another one? Like sleep. Sleep seems big, but like at the same time, I don't know how much of a difference it would make, assuming people are doing training. I
think the bigger.
So what is it?
Maybe I'll try to simplify it a little bit. Instead of like thinking about each one of these isolated factors and like how much of a difference is this necessarily going to make, the way that I like to think about it more so is like the cumulative effect of all of these pseudo random things. If we only take two measurements of an individual, if all the pinballs just happen to bounce in one direction versus the other, it can distort the effect. That's the point. And because the differences we're trying to measure are typically so small, any distortion is really, really important. And I like to think about it in like a group-based study because it's more intuitive that way. If we only had like 2 or 3 people in each group, it's immediately obvious that if the pinballs bounce in one way, a couple people in this group are maybe not built well for the machine that the study was tested on, or whatever those random aspects of recruitment just happen to be weird in those 2 groups. It's easier to understand like, oh, that's kind of a weird difference, but you're doing that now within an individual. And so it is an unintuitive topic, and I totally understand. And I'm excited to hopefully see some more data in this area, because it's interesting. And I think the way that I approach my PhD is like telling us what the data say on average is cool, but I care about helping individuals. How do we inform those things? And I think as of now, at least, and of course I'm open to changing my mind with more data, I tend to think that the estimates that we get for groups on average are probably most justifiable for individuals. And the aspect of the medical situation I think blows this out of my mind even more is, even if there were truly high volume and low volume responders, they've done like simulations in the medical world that treating everybody as if they're actually the same sometimes leads to better outcomes than treating people as an individual, because the methods you need to do to diagnose those things have error with them as well. We have to estimate those things. And if the differences are already really small, who's to say not treating everybody at the same is still not even a better approach, even if it's not true?
So here's, I'm probably coming off as like extremely resistant.
No,
but I'm not.
Hey, trust me, everybody was, and I was the same way.
So there seems to be 2 potential explanations here. One is kind of like a measurement / like study limitation thing, right? Where it's like, the machine was just wonky that day, or blah, 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 whatever, human error, limitations to do with the collection of the data. Okay. Then the other thing is like true intersubject differences. Okay. So those could be genetic, they could be environmental. Like they're really only those two things, right? Now, so to me, like the research thing is kind of interesting, but at the same time, it's only interesting to us because we want to do research. Okay, so let's put that aside.
Sure.
All right.
Yep.
Do you, well, first, before I put it aside, do you think that the research limitations, the measurement limitations is mostly responsible for this, or is it like just one of a number of factors?
In the sense that you're saying that, I guess to me that is the key thing. It would be like saying that we can conclude something from a study that has one subject in the high volume group and one subject in the low volume group. It's like on that level. Like it literally can't even get off the ground because of the fact that it's not designed to answer that question.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way that I view it, is like of course we can have our prior beliefs, our experience that may put us in kind of one category, but purely speaking off the data, the way that I like to frame it is like, there was like a couple papers that I would use to say training responses are insanely variable. And that probably is also the case for the training conditions that people tend to respond best to. I would say pretty much all of those studies don't have the design to actually say that that is the case. And so then we're left with, okay, we don't really have much data at all that is designed adequately to actually investigate these individual differences really robustly. What are the few papers that we have? And those seem to cast a little bit of doubt on that variability being nearly as much as we would actually expect.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to say and pretend that there's not some limitations with those studies, of course, and I still have my prior beliefs and experiences just like anybody else, but I've grown throughout this process. Once I've kind of gripped with and realized how much of a difference that really can make in comparison to the things that we're trying to detect, it really can completely muddy the waters to make you see and feel things that are there that really aren't. And I think in the practical realm, when we feel like we have these really strong anecdotes, there's just so many other things that are going on that make it hard for those to be really robust in the inferences that we would draw from them.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's just say like it is mostly just like a limitation of doing this type of research that lasts this long, and we just have a lot of confounders, right? And in measurement, error, variability, blah, blah, blah. Does that, do you think that undermines the confidence that we should have in this area of research just in general?
I'd flip it.
Okay.
So to me, again, I'm somewhat speaking my opinion now here. If I was putting all the individual differences research hat on and trying to be as forthright and like honest as possible, I would have a lot of caution here, but this is more so me speaking freely. So to me, I kind of think about it like this. If we assume that the true individual differences in terms of training responses between different interventions, which I think is really the only practical thing, coming back to like just the general genetics one, if that's true, great. If it's not true, who cares? Because we can't really do anything about it. It's just like you just happen to be a better responder to training than me. And that's just kind of is what it is. So I tend to spend less time thinking about that, except for the fact that that kind of gives us some insight to the absolute magnitude of variability that we would expect between different interventions. And because that's small between individuals in general, and then we move to between two different interventions, that's probably going to be even smaller, which seemed to be verified from my study, which again is very small and is more so a philosophical point. But once we understand that, to me, I take research and say, okay, on average, the group effects are probably going to be pretty effective recommendations to everyone. So if we can do really, really high quality, effective group level research, it actually underlines and makes that even more practically applicable. But as we discussed at length, the studies can only investigate certain things in terms of practical realm. So when we go to the volume research, for example, my study may suggest that higher volumes are better on average, but that doesn't necessarily mean from a practical point of view that everyone is going to be able to tolerate that given their life circumstances, their effort, their goals, all those kind of things. Those are still very real considerations. So from a coaching perspective, you kind of end up at the same point, but your troubleshooting and the framework you use to make decisions can kind of potentially put off to the side this insidious kind of thing that, oh man, I think Jeff should do more, but what if he's actually a low volume responder that does better with 6 sets than 25 sets? And if you just think about that intuitively, that seems pretty reasonable to me, in the idea that there just isn't going to be this random aspect of things that you are truly going to have different molecular mechanisms that are optimized at 6 sets as opposed to the same senses everywhere else.
So wait, so you think like, okay, so you really do think that like people are less of their own special snowflake than they
100%.
think. Okay. I can get on board with that.
With respect to different interventions.
The response
within the
to
same
with different
person.
interventions. Absolutely. Okay. Now, I think that like a scientific skeptic, so to speak, could like hear everything that you just said about all of this and come away with the other conclusion, which is where my instinct went, which is like, okay, even like if these things can vary that much, then like what are we doing here, right? Like this is all just noise. But I think like you said, there's a difference between detecting differences within or between individuals with different interventions versus a given intervention causing a specific effect at the group level.
Bingo.
And if there isn't huge individual variability between individuals, then those group differences are generalizable. Yeah, exactly.
If we have such a hard time detecting the differences between interventions, as Zac outlined, with laboratory equipment and controlled scenarios,
how are you doing that?
How are you doing that in practice just based on your intuition or your circumference measurements? Don't get me wrong. I think tracking individual progress is definitely something worth your time. But I maybe to distill the discussion down and to give the listener my takeaway from being a part of, but not being as in the weeds as you have been on this topic, is training principles and the application thereof should be largely input-based. So in other words, we should use research to inform the principles and therefore the inputs based on the goal for the individual, as opposed to saying, okay, that's just an okay starting point. What I'm really going to rely on is my actual outcomes based on some sort of metric that you collect or your intuition. Again, because we have such a hard time doing that in a laboratory setting, we're even more skeptical you could do that in practice. Now, again, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take progress photos or you shouldn't check out, what your muscle thickness is if you have access to that. But just be aware of those limitations and use them as an indication you're moving in the right direction, as opposed to trying to tease apart very small differences between different interventions, because I think that's just so far from realistic based on this line of research.
And going back to the 95% of people that we were talking about earlier, like, imagine this, right? Like this is the scenario that I think of too. And like, it really kind of solidifies my opinion that I'm okay believing this. Is like, if you come up to somebody who's new in the gym, like, all right, so we're going to start training, but we got to make sure that you're a high volume responder before we start this program so you don't get worse results. And just like it compounds and how complex it is. And you just kind of take a step back. You're like, nah, I think training's probably pretty good for everybody. And on average, doing more of it's probably going to get you better results.
Right.
The last thing I'd mention too, that I'd be remiss not to say, is the only study that I'm aware of that investigated this between interventions is the dissertation project, and that was between volume. I personally think if we're gonna like take a step back and think about what training variables we can tentatively think probably fit in this kind of bucket of things that probably aren't too much different, I would say it is any variable that you can manipulate within yourself. What doesn't fit that category is things like exercise selection and things like that, where your biomechanics may influence the way certain exercises map onto your body versus somebody else. Now, like the muscle mechanics aspect of things, like the stretch position versus the short position, things like that, maybe that's relatively similar, but actual practical exercises of you going to squat versus me going to squat, we very well may expect completely different responses from that, because in reality, it's not really the same exercise. That's kind of the way that I think about it. So exercise selection, which I think is the strongest place that people have anecdotes. I like that machine, don't like that machine. I like this rep range with this certain exercise. I hate this. I think all of those things kind of come back to these area of things where you can't really manipulate it within yourself. Whereas the training variables of like writing down in your logbook what you're going to do, A or B, those are a little bit, I'm more comfortable with saying probably fit in the former case.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the fallacy is, but like I know maybe it's like attribution error or something. Like people will, they will have, I hear this so much, it drives me insane, but it's like, oh, I did science-based lifting for, 2 years. And then I started and I immediately switched to like Mike Mentz or something else or whatever. I just started going hard and trained like a bro again. And like I immediately got so much better results. That works better for me. And it's like, bro, like there are so many other things that could have happened at that same time. Like not to mention whatever you were calling science-based training was probably not. Like it was, you were probably just not training hard enough, and then you started training hard and you made those better gains. So it's like that alone would explain it. But like also like when people when people have a really good experience at a certain phase of their training career, that maps onto usually a certain phase in their life when there could be all of these other things going on that you allude to, right? And it's like,
first
then
couple
they
years of
attribute
college,
it to the new training thing and not all these other things, right?
I see that all the time in my coaching practice. It's like people are kind of trying to like chase this experience they had in the past with a certain program and they kind of return to it. But it's like, no, you're not in college anymore. And if you go back to squatting 4 times a week, that you just can't do that anymore, and that's okay, right?
Yeah,
Again, if you look at the dose-response relationship between frequency and strength, we see that there's a decently strong relationship here. So, but it starts working against you because your life context is different. So you can no longer tolerate it, and now you're basically taken away from the effective training under the curve.
Yeah.
That's how I think we should think about training, not necessarily, I love that word elusive, and shout out to Dr. Eric Helms, because conversations we've had with him about it, he used that term and it stuck with us. Because I think this concept takes you away from chasing this elusive thing, this elusive optimal program for me.
Downturn of
and
the
it's so
inverted U.
freeing to just say, I know I need to train hard. I can look at projects
Simpler.
like this, and I can understand the general dose-response relationships. Keep in mind, these are wrong.
Yeah.
These are wrong. We just don't know why they're wrong. We'll get more data over the next 10 years, hopefully update them, better inform the precision. So this is just the best guess we have.
Hold on. What do you mean by they're wrong?
They're wrong in the sense that
All models are wrong, some are useful.
all models are wrong, some are useful, right? So just for example, if we double the data set, the exact estimates at a given set volume are going to change, right? So when I say it's wrong, I don't mean like fundamentally wrong. I mean that this is the best we can do with the methods we're aware of now and the data we have access
What
to
60
now.
sets look like, for example? Like 60 sets could
To your
take
point, what if
I don't think I would say it's wrong. It's just incomplete, right?
It's
unfinished or
it's
something.
me being an overly cautious
cautious,
scientist
yeah.
when I say that.
Sure.
It's
But
it's got a shelf life, maybe? I don't know.
I don't think
It's our best guess. It's literally our best guess.
Again, it is, this is a communication thing, but I think like when
probably not the best.
when people hear wrong, they're like, there's mistakes in it.
No.
You know, like you crunch the numbers wrong.
Sure.
I think I think it would take a lot of evidence to overturn the trends.
Your job as a scientist is to be the most skeptical of your own work.
Yeah.
And we absolutely try not to be exceptions to that.
Sure. Yeah.
So like I'm going to make this quick because this is a detail, but just to give an example. In order to anchor the dose-response relationship, so basically what happens from 0 set to 1 set, that's might have downstream implications on like what the rest of the curve looks like kind of in that general area. But keep in mind, in order to have that general relationship from 0 sets to 1 set, you need to have effects at 0 sets and at 1 set. What is an effect at 0 sets? It's no training, it's a control condition. We did include control conditions the best we could, but there weren't a ton. So in other words, the way that this dose-response relationship is anchored is limited. It's the best we can do with what we have access to, but it's very possible that the diminishing returns are even stronger. So in other words, this slope relative to later in the dose-response relationship is even stronger if we had more control effects. That's what I mean by wrong.
It's just things like that.
So you're basically just saying like the difference between doing no sets, so not training, and doing 1 set could actually be bigger than we realize.
Exactly.
And going back to the proximity to failure data, that's like something I would I've looked at it since, so I kind of know what it says, but including control data and looking at things in a slightly different way, there's probably a little bit of diminishing returns that occur like really early in the relationship, like we were alluding to, where there's probably, a point where you start to really get some effective
And
progress.
we were joking about that 5-hour podcast. And again, it's not for the algorithm, but the reason we have that and it's in the methods and we have extensive supplementary materials online if someone really wants to go down the rabbit hole, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it's there for a reason. Because the goal as a scientist is to be like transparent in every single step of the process. Because when you go through this process, you realize that like there's no step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 guideline for how to do projects like this, right? There's decisions you have to make that you try to make the best possible decision as a scientist, but you just need to be open about that, transparent about it, because there are trade-offs with every single decision. So I think as scientists, we're really big on the fact that like we'll do the best we can now, but things change, and that's normal, and just being open-minded is a cornerstone of science.
All right. Well, end it with this question. I want to hear what both of you guys think is, or what's something that each of you guys you think is true, but you don't have the evidence to support it yet.
That's a great question.
Oh man, you're first.
That's a great question. Oh man. So it's tricky because like there's nothing that jumps out at me right away, but there are things decisions I make all the time that I don't have like super strong evidence for, if that makes sense. So one that comes to mind for me is I make a lot of decisions or general recommendations on the nutrition front and how that interfaces with training that we don't necessarily have strong evidence for. So what comes to mind for me is that with a slightly greater surplus, the general benefit you could get from higher volume is there. So in other words, you can kind of scale the degree to which you crank things up based on the magnitude of the surplus. I don't have any research for that. I do think that's the case, and that kind of circles back to some of our discussions before about like what actually determines the max hypertrophy that can occur in a given 10-week study. And I think you could scale that concept up and down based on magnitude of surplus, magnitude of deficit, et cetera. So that's what comes to mind for me. There's a few other that came to mind, but
Man, no, that's a good one. The individual differences stuff I think is kind of my calling card of something that's a little bit off the beaten path. But in terms of stuff that's more well explored, like, man, I really am struggling to think of something that's actually pretty good.
Is that because you feel like we actually have evidence to support most things that you think about?
It's twofold. It's one, I don't think the differences are that large for many things.
Okay.
So that's part of it. So like, what's the magnitude of the things that we're working with that makes nothing really stick out to me? Like one thing I thought of was like, I think training with multiple rep ranges is probably better on average. The data really don't seem to suggest that too strongly. I think that probably makes sense. You can make a couple rational arguments, but I also think the difference is infinitesimally small. That really wouldn't be something.
Do you really think it's infinitesimally small though? Like, I mean, let's just say I only did 4 to 6 reps versus I did a bit of 4 to 6. I did mostly 6 to 12, and then I did some 12 to 30. Like, you really think that like I could just go all 4 to 6 and it not be a difference?
I think that particular example would be pretty small in most cases.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so. In most cases, I do think the obvious thing there is, again, coming back to the practical, is like I just don't think those lower rep ranges allow you to train certain exercises with equipment constraints. Maybe you're not hitting lateral raises as much as you otherwise would. So it's hard, but like, yeah, like those types of things I think are relatively, I guess this is maybe one of my, not hot take, but a hotter take. I think the idea of like training a muscle where it's strongest rather than the stretch position, I tend to think that fits with my...
That's a good answer.
That tends to fit with purely just, I understand the debates. I understand both sides of the evidence. I think they both totally make sense. And I think you could make a compelling argument that on average, the more the stretch position favoring makes sense. But I think if you're training both things to failure, I tend to just vibes-based align with the idea that if you train a muscle in a range where it's relatively strong and produces force well, and then kind of leaning maybe a little bit more on the stretch end of things from that kind of little window, I think that makes sense. But stretch at all costs, that kind of thing, like the caricature position of that, I tend to not align with a ton.
Okay.
And I think that bears out with like the way that people say that certain machines really feel solid and injuries and also things like that. But yeah, I think that probably is maybe somewhat surprising.
It is actually. One thing you've already said in this conversation actually that I was kind of like, about was that you emphasized exercise, like exercise variation, or not exercise, exercise selection being an actually important factor. Whereas I think the standard like science-based dogma is like, no, like that's like at the top.
I think
I tend to like be pretty strong in that direction.
You
like,
rock with the exercise tier lists?
No.
It's almost like on an individual level.
Right.
Yeah, like I guess the thing that I'm pretty, so I'll put kind of the full idea on paper, I guess. I think, gains taper off pretty quickly. But I do think that regional hypertrophy is definitely a thing. And I think that goes on a deeper level than a lot of people think. And so I think if you can have exercises that challenge different resistance profiles based on their length tension relationship, all those kind of things, I think it just generally makes sense that more exercise variety will allow you to hit more of those fibers in a position that has high passive and active forces, which is kind of the idea that I think you're kind of shooting for, is this total summation of active and passive force, which is where I think what I'm basically saying is like you want to have it in a range where it produces force well actively, but then if from that range, if we can get the optimization of that plus the passive forces, that probably is kind of serving both masters there with respect to this conversation. But in general, yeah, I think just purely from my coaching experience and just what makes sense to me as opposed to what I have evidence for, I think high exercise variety, things like this that kind of map to the different architectural properties of the different muscles, I think generally makes sense personally.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Since it came up, I have to end on this note, which is going to be where we've got a really quick elevator trip. We're only going up a couple floors.
Okay.
What should I call this? The stretch for hypertrophy.
Sure.
Overrated or underrated?
Overrated.
Overrated.
Overrated? And okay, give me a little bit more than that. Like,
I think personally, I think that the difference in gains over a career that you would have from training a relatively high volume, moderate frequency, close proximity to failure training programs between exercises that what I would just consider feel good versus ones that are like mega stretch optimized caricature position on Instagram, I think is going to be essentially nothing personally. That's just just kind of my vibe opinion. And I tend to think there are certain cases, again, this is more of the caricature view and maybe the less of the good faith view. I think there are compromises that are made for exercises that really, really focus on the stretch that I think take away from really important aspects of progressive training over the years that are really, really important.
Keep in mind that a lot of the muscle length research is really looking at efficiency as opposed to effectiveness. So what I mean by efficiency is, as a researcher, if you're comparing longer versus shorter muscle lengths or exercise A versus exercise B, you're going to control everything else, including the number of sets, right? And that makes sense. You should do that as a researcher. But in practice, that might not be the case. Your tolerance for the exercise that lost might be higher, right? And you might be able to do more sets. And so therefore, when you're looking at volume equated studies, looking at other variables, you're really looking at efficiency.
On a per set
And I think that's a really overlooked aspect of hypertrophy research is we're really looking at efficiency, not effectiveness.
The other thing too, especially with anything related to exercise selection and things like this, I think this is a case where not having the full training programs is absolutely vital. The classic example I like to utilize for this is just the hamstring study by Mayo. Really well done study, used MRI, did a ton of measurements. It was really effectively demonstrated the concept that on average, the seated hamstring curl seemed to beat out the lying hamstring curl. Now, some of the muscles on the front of the body, the lying hamstring curl actually did better, which I think strengthened their hypothesis on terms of the length of the muscle.
Agree.
Fantastic. However, the thing that people don't talk about is when you go to put seated hamstring curls in your training log and you go to the gym on Monday, what's the exercise you're doing before that? RDL, stiff leg deadlift, something like that, that also trains the stretch positions of the hamstring. Are you actually losing out on some potential progress from hitting things in different manners when you layer all of the exercise on the training program on top of it that hit things from different angles, resistance profiles, et cetera? So the exercise variety component of things is kind of, again, I come back to it just from a practical perspective, is that we often are not testing these things in a full training program that kind of features all the big rock movements that kind of hit a lot of things at once. And then we're looking, where can we kind of optimize from here with how do I perform my chest flies? How do I perform my rear delt flies? How do I perform my leg extensions on top of already doing a training program that's going to have predominantly hit joint angles, resistance profiles, things like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's often overlooked, and the hamstring example is just one that comes to mind. If I'm doing RDLs and seated hamstring curls, is that redundant versus RDLs versus prone hamstring curls, which are going to hit my sartorius, where the seated hamstring curls wouldn't.
Yeah,
so that's
a great point.
That's kind of
I agree. I mean, I've always kind of thought that people like view these, especially when it comes to exercise selection, they view them in isolation. So it's like, oh, the bench press is not a great pec builder because you don't get a lot of stretch. It's like, yeah, but I literally do cable flies right after it.
Exactly.
So like, how
Bingo.
Exactly. That gap is immediately filled, right? Okay, since you guys are like, I consider you guys to be like, two of few people who are like really advancing the field forward. This is just like for my own personal interest. Is there a take you've heard me have that you've disagreed with? You can be honest. I'm not going to be offended. I want I don't know if I can call myself a scientist, but like as someone who is like scientifically minded, I always want to be like cognizant of what I'm saying and update stances. I've got no problem, admitting I was wrong on something. And if anything comes to mind, if nothing comes to mind immediately,
So with your experiment, and you might have to help me out about this a bit. So it was definitely of interest to me because you had referenced some of the studies. So we're like, okay, let's think about this a little bit. So with your experiment, if memory serves, you did the first year was like more moderate / higher volumes, right? And then you kind of continued it on with a lower volume. Is that accurate?
So it was actually less controlled than that. I have all the data.
Okay.
But it was more so like I would typically do 3 or 4 sets on an exercise, and I just started doing 1 or 2 sets on an exercise.
Yeah.
So like this is where like I did change the title from like experiment to just literally I cut my volume in half. Because that's really what it was. And this is actually like part of, so this was one piece of a bigger case study with me and my brother that I kind of pulled out because we were doing this like high volume thing for this whole year, the first phase. And then I was like, man, when I cut, like I really don't want to be doing that because it was like already, I did see significant gains, but like it comes back to like, was it worth it? I don't know.
That's
and
such
like,
a
for me, it was
example.
like, it kind of was, but it was right on that thing where it's like, I have a lot of work to be doing with the lab. So anyway, long story short, I did cut everything down from like 3 to 4 sets down to 1 to 2 sets. So yeah.
This isn't a critique, but maybe more so something I was just interested. I would have been interested to see when you were discussing that decrease in volume is basically looking at the ratio of lean mass gain or loss versus fat mass loss and how that ratio changed upon the change in volume. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know if we would be able to do that. So we did do MRI, but I'm saving that for like when it's fully done.
Sure.
Or not MRI, sorry. We did ultrasound.
Yeah.
And I'm saving that data for when we're fully done. But because the change happened when I went, it wasn't perfectly clean, but it basically went from like the bulking experiment to then the cutting experiment. That was when the shift happened. It would be near impossible to figure out like, the best case would be like, I mean, even this study would have a lot of issues.
Yeah, and
but
then
ideally I'd be like in the same deficit for 12 weeks, running like a high volume thing, do some washout, do that same deficit again with low volume, see which one maintains muscle better. But like it's not really doable.
Yeah. I guess and I think you would.
I guess it would be doable, but like this truly was an anecdote with measurements.
100%.
Like it truly was just like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to collect the measurements and then I'm going to present what happened, which was why, and I did get some flack for that, which I think is justified. But I wanted to, for that reason in that video, I wanted to like contextualize it with all of the like actual published research. And like, I actually spent more time talking about that research than I did like my own findings, which were just kind of like, hey, for me, the takeaway from that was like, it's actually kind of interesting that like, not only did I maintain my lean mass, I actually gained a little bit and I continued to make strength despite going from doing 3 to 4 sets per exercise down to 1 to 2 sets per exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the takeaway. The takeaway I don't think should have been, and I don't think I said this, but if I implied it, then that's on me. But like, it wasn't that like, I think I maintained my muscle better because I did low volume. It's more so like, I could maintain my muscle on less volume than I would have thought.
I exactly. And it's so hard.
Seems like an internal contradiction, but it's not.
When someone listens to like words that someone says when they're trying to communicate science, like it's so tricky because you want to be clear, you also want to be accurate, but it's easy. It's just so hard to do that. So I guess what I was getting at is like, I agree with what you just said completely. And I don't even know if you said this. It might just be like what is easy to take away if you don't really listen closely. It's not necessarily due to the fact that you cut your volume in half that you were able to maintain your lean mass or maybe even gain some, but instead that slight shift in presentation of, oh, this is cool. Maybe lower volumes are more than sufficient for my goals in the short term, right? And that's a slight shift in framing that allows people to still look at our best estimate of the general relationship and learn how to practically apply it for themselves. Hey, here's the relationship. For me, in the short term, it was going to work against me a bit in terms of doing higher volumes, and therefore I would lose out on focus and intent and maybe my ability to push all the way to failure or close to it earlier in the workout. Therefore, this was sustainable for me. This was the best call for me. Maybe if that's the case for you as well, try it out for yourself. Which, again, I'm sure you said that, but I'm more so maybe just clarifying potential misunderstandings.
Oh, totally, dude. No, this is something like I want to improve as much as possible, which is why like I have a good team of like actual researchers around me now to like help actually do real research and present it that way. And if it's not real research, if it's an anecdote with measurements, then it's presented that way. To be like clear though, like I do suspect that if I had done that, let's just say we could like
a parallel universe,
clone me, you know? Parallel universe. It could clone me, and like I did high volume training. I think it would have been worse. And I don't think it's because I respond better to low volume. Okay, whatever. I think it's because of like I literally think it's mostly just because of the focus effect. Like I think I just enjoyed the workouts more, and like I did tap into like that extra level of like pushing hard. And I could be wrong about this, but like I think my recovery was like perfect. Like I was getting to that point where it was like I could feel I was like getting more food focused. I got down to 9%. I was pretty shredded, not super shredded, but like definitely lean, right? Like properly lean. And at that point, it's just like, dude, those high volume workouts, I resent the gym. I do not want to train. And like, how can you possibly put your best foot forward when you're training that way? So I don't know.
You asked the question of like, what's something we don't have good data for that you believe? Here's another one is I think actually a lot of people can get better results when in a deficit because they're so excited about training and they tick their other boxes. So that might have been a little bit of what's going on in the sense that like, again, physiologically, that doesn't really make sense. But I think that just like the focus effect, some of the pacing concepts we talked about, motivation, how much are you thinking about like your pre-workout meal a little bit? How excited are you to progress week over week? How cool is it to like see yourself in the locker room after the session and you're noticing you're leaner than you were when you hit this session last week? I think those things can often override stuff like this.
I think so too.
And I think you might have that might explain it to some degree, right?
Nonetheless, the point I wanted to make with that is just to circle back really quickly to clarify, like it wasn't that I necessarily think like lower volumes are definitely better in a deficit. It was more so, isn't it interesting that like I could literally go down to half and still maintain? Like I wouldn't have expected that. So that was kind of the takeaway for me. And I also, you know what? After having it, screw it, I'll say it. I do think that like most people should just do low volumes when they cut, simply because like most people aren't even like concerned with optimizing. And then when you're in a deficit, you're not optimizing anyway because you're not in a surplus. So it's like if you can reap most of the rewards with less sets, then like why wouldn't you do that? That isn't to say that if someone is like a professional natural bodybuilder and they're trying to optimize everything, okay, now that's a circumstance where I'm ambivalent to probably leaning toward more volume being more appropriate in that case. But if we're talking like average population people looking for fat loss, like I just think you can make a way stronger case for lower volumes.
I think you should do low volume all the time if that's your
honestly, maybe.
I think I agree. I think what you just described, I think applies in both scenarios, in a surplus or maintenance or deficit. And I think, man, like I said, like just intent matters so much. How this is getting a little bit into the like more conceptual area of proximity to failure. Which would be this paper, is that like I do think that not all like sets at one RAR are created equal. Like we do have some research where like whether or not there are spotters around, whether or not you're listening to preferred music, whether or not you are mentally fatigued due to something you did right before the session, like scrolling on social media has been tested.
Yeah.
Those things can influence how many reps you get when you do a maximal set to failure, even though like at the actual level of the muscle, at least we can assume that nothing's actually going on, but your ability to reach certain levels of effort changes. So I've mentioned this a couple times, but I think pacing, I think perception of effort, I think intent, motivation, is like simple as that sounds. Those things like really do override a lot of these things. Like I think a lot of these things are the cherry on top. They can tell us really good like things about what's necessary to grow and how to optimize that. But like those are the cornerstones that can often, if they're not in place, then this is all.
And I think the interesting thing about that too is like the studies essentially select to make sure every single one of those boxes are checked. Yeah. You have a laboratory environment literally screaming at you in like a 3-to-1 ratio where it does, doesn't make sense. So like the practical case of making sure that the pacing effect and the focus effect are kind of accounted for as best as they can. That's probably still happening to some degree, but it's literally external things in the environment, texting you to make sure you're at your session. Hey, let's go start your warm up. All right, I got your warm up weights. I'm going to load all your plates for you. Like all of those things probably try to reduce the barrier to making sure the focus effect isn't a thing. But in practice, you can never avoid it.
And for me, man, like even just knowing I was getting measurements done gave me so much accountability.
100%.
Like it's insane how much of a difference that makes. Like knowing I've got a measurement day coming up, bro. Like 100%. I'm like, okay, I want to see something.
I think having a coach is another big one too.
Yeah.
In part because of that, it's like, hey, you need to take progress photos or take measurements or whatever every so often. You're going to be on your P's and Q's a little bit more. And again, I think those things,
protein intake dialed, sleep dialed, all those kind of things you don't even realize subconsciously. Making sure I get my water and make sure my performance is good on this.
Yeah, just generally accountability.
Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah. All right, guys. Do you want to like? Where is it that people can find you? This was fantastic. Conversation is really good. I actually learned a nice bit of stuff.
That's awesome, man. Yeah. I'd say the best place to go is probably datadrivenstrength.com. Sign up for our newsletter. You can keep up with what we're doing there. On Instagram, I'm josh.datadrivenstrength, and you're the same, Zac.datadrivenstrength.
Great. And what's data-driven strength? Is that mostly coaching or?
Yeah, it's coaching, and then we also have a podcast where we try to communicate some of the science we do, science that other people
5-hour episodes.
5-hour episodes.
No doubt there are people listening who are like, I could rock with a 5. Like honestly, after talking to you guys, like I had dabbled in a few of those, but like I'm gonna go back and listen, man. You guys are like really balanced. To be honest with you, I was a bit. I don't know why. Maybe you guys suffer from the straw manning online sometimes or whatnot. But I did expect you to be more
#science pilled.
No, not even science pilled. I expected you guys to be more volume pilled for sure. And I also expected you to be a little more like failure pilled, just because those were like, the abstract takeaway.
I think once you've done those projects and got your hands dirty with them, I think that is the most sobering experience to realize what it can and can't tell you. So I think that usually reflects our views on a lot of things. Like
my favorite. So basically, this is like Zac's meta-analysis is like, again, surface level, pro failure. My meta-analysis, pro high volume. My favorite is when people are like, oh, that Robinson paper, they really know about training hard. That Pelland paper, they clearly didn't think about proximity failure. And they don't realize that it's the same authors, just in a different order.
That's happened a lot more than you'd expect. That's happened a lot more than you'd expect.
That's great. Okay. All right, guys. That's all I've got. Thanks so much for coming on. It was great. Anybody watching, make sure you leave us a thumbs up. Go check out their social media. I'll link everything down below. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. See you guys here on the next one.